Welcome, champion of justice, to a journey through the timeless realm of Themyscira, where ancient gods still walk among mortals and the echoes of heroic deeds ripple across the cosmos like prayers carried on Mediterranean winds. Tonight, we shall trace the complete chronicles of Diana of Themyscira, she who became Wonder Woman, from her clay-born origins in Paradise Island's sacred groves to her battles against the forces that would corrupt or destroy the world of mortals. Let the rhythm of waves against marble shores and the whisper of golden lasso in starlight carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore every thread of heroism that defines the amazing Amazon. Close your eyes, seeker of truth, and let this tale of clay and starlight unfold. In the beginning, before the red, gold, and blue became symbols of hope across the world, before the golden eagle blazed upon the chest of Earth's most compassionate warrior, there existed a realm so perfect that the gods themselves had chosen it as sanctuary from the corrupted world of mortals. This was Themyscira, known to the outside world as Paradise Island, where marble columns rose from shores, kissed by eternal spring, and where the wisest women who had ever lived found refuge from the violence and hatred that consumed the lands beyond the mystical barriers that protected their sacred home. The story begins not with the birth of a child, but with the deepest longing of a mother's heart, a yearning so profound that it would move the very gods to intervene in the natural order of creation itself. Queen Hippolyta, ruler of the Amazons, had led her sisters through centuries of peace and prosperity, yet within her noble breast burned an emptiness that no amount of wisdom or achievement could fill. She was surrounded by the greatest warriors, scholars, and artisans that womankind had ever produced, yet she remained alone in the most fundamental way that any sentient being can experience solitude. The Amazons of Themyscira were immortal, blessed by the gods with eternal life, as reward for their virtue and their rejection of the world of men that had brought them only suffering and betrayal in ages past. They were warriors who had transcended the need for warfare, scholars who had achieved perfect understanding of justice and truth, artists who created beauty that would endure long after civilizations rose and fell in the distant world beyond their shores. Yet for all their perfection, they lacked the one thing that gives meaning to immortality, the hope of continuity, the promise that their wisdom and values would live on in new forms and new hearts. Hippolyta had ruled for 3,000 years, watching empires rise and fall through the mystical windows that allowed glimpses of the outer world, yet she had never experienced the most fundamental joy and responsibility that defined the lives of mortal women. She had never held a child in her arms, never watched a young mind discover truth for the first time, never felt the mixture of pride and terror that comes from knowing that one's own values and dreams would live on in another's heart long after one's own story had ended. The other Amazons understood their queen's longing, for many of them had once been mothers in the world beyond Themyscira's shores, before tragedy and betrayal had driven them to seek refuge on Paradise Island. They had left behind children when they fled the world of men, sacrificing the most precious bonds of their mortal lives in order to preserve their own souls from corruption and destruction. The pain of that loss had never fully healed, even across centuries of peace and fulfillment, and they recognized in their beloved queen the same hunger for maternal love that had once defined their own existence. Yet the laws that governed Themyscira seemed to make such hopes impossible, for the island was protected by ancient enchantments that prevented any male from setting foot upon its sacred soil, and the Amazons themselves had sworn eternal oaths of separation from the world of men that had caused them such suffering. They were immortal and perfect, yet they were also barren, doomed to exist forever without the possibility of new life or new hope joining their ranks. The circle of their existence, however beautiful and meaningful, remained forever closed. It was in the depths of such contemplation that Queen Hippolyta found herself walking along the shores of Paradise Island one night when the moon hung full and silver above the wine-dark waters of the Mediterranean. The beach where she wandered was composed not of ordinary sand but of the finest clay, white and pure as fresh snow, shaped by centuries of gentle waves into forms of surpassing smoothness and beauty. This was sacred clay, blessed by the gods themselves, and imbued with the power to hold and preserve the impressions of divine will. As Hippolyta walked, her hands began to move without conscious direction, gathering the sacred clay and shaping it with the same care and skill that she had once used to forge weapons and create works of art in the early days of Themyscira's founding. Yet this was different from any creation she had ever attempted, for her hands were guided not by artistic vision but by the deepest longings of her heart, the most fundamental desires of her soul made manifest in physical form. What emerged from her unconscious shaping was the figure of a child, a daughter perfect in every proportion and feature, reflecting all the beauty and nobility that defined the Amazon race, while possessing a unique grace and strength that seemed to transcend even those exalted standards. The clay infant lay upon the beach like a sculpture awaiting the breath of life, and as Hippolyta gazed upon her handiwork, she felt a stirring in her heart that she had never experienced in 3 millennia of existence. The tears that fell from the Amazon Queen's eyes as she knelt beside her clay daughter were not tears of sorrow, but of hope so intense that it bordered on anguish. The recognition that she held within her power the possibility of fulfilling the deepest dream of her immortal existence. Yet she also understood that clay, however skillfully shaped, and however much love was poured into its formation, remained merely clay without the intervention of forces greater than mortal will could command. The prayers that rose from Hippolyta's lips that night were not the formal invocations that marked Amazon religious observances, but the raw pleading of a mother's heart that transcended the boundaries between mortal and divine. She called upon the gods who had blessed the Themyscira with their protection, who had granted the Amazons immortality and wisdom, who had provided sanctuary for women who sought justice and peace in a world that offered neither. The response came not as thunder or celestial voice, but as the gradual gathering of presences that filled the night air with power and benevolence beyond mortal comprehension. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, was the first to manifest, her radiance lending warmth to the cool sea breeze, and her presence filling Hippolyta's heart with the certainty that love was indeed the most powerful force in all creation. Athena followed, bringing wisdom and the promise that knowledge and justice would guide the child's path through whatever trials awaited her in the years to come. Artemis arrived with the wild freedom of the hunt and the fierce protectiveness of the guardian, ensuring that the child would possess the courage to face any enemy and the strength to defend those who could not defend themselves. Demeter brought the blessings of growth and nurturing, the promise that the child would mature in harmony with the natural world and would always find sustenance and support in the earth itself. Hestia offered the gift of home and hearth, the assurance that no matter how far the child might travel or how many battles she might face, she would always carry within her heart the peace and security of Themyscira's love. Each goddess contributed her own unique gifts to the clay form that lay silent and still upon the sacred beach. Yet it was the collective breath of all the divine beings present that finally sparked the miracle of animation. The clay began to warm beneath their combined blessing, taking on the rosy flush of living flesh as divine essence merged with earthly form to create something unprecedented in the history of both mortal and immortal realms. The child's first breath was drawn not from her own lungs, but from the very air of paradise itself, pure and sweet, with the fragrance of eternal spring flowers, and carrying within it all the hopes and dreams of the Amazon nation. Her eyes opened to reveal the deep blue of the Mediterranean at its most pristine, reflecting the sky and holding within their depths the promise of wisdom beyond her apparent years. Her hair was black as a moonless night, yet shot through with highlights that caught the starlight and seemed to hold it captive within their silken strands. Yet it was not her physical beauty that took Hippolyta's breath away as she lifted her newborn daughter for the first time, but rather the sense of presence that emanated from the tiny form, the unmistakable feeling that this child carried within her the potential to change the world in ways that even the gods themselves could not fully foresee. The clay that had been shaped by a mother's love and blessed by divine power had become something more than the sum of its parts. A being who bridged the gap between mortal and immortal, human and divine, earth and sky. The name that came to Hippolyta's lips as she cradled her daughter was not chosen through deliberation or consultation with the other Amazons, but arose from the depths of her soul as naturally as breathing itself. Diana, for the Roman goddess of the hunt and the moon, protector of the innocent and guardian of the wild places where freedom still flourished. It was a name that carried within it the promise of strength and independence, compassion and justice, the perfect synthesis of all the virtues that the Amazons held most sacred. The other Amazons who came to witness this miraculous birth were moved to tears by the sight of their beloved queen holding the child who would be daughter to them all, the living embodiment of their hopes for the future and their faith in the possibility of redemption for a world that had caused them so much pain. Yet even in their joy, they recognized that this birth was not merely a personal blessing for Hippolyta, but a cosmic event whose implications would extend far beyond the shores of Paradise Island. The child Diana was more than daughter and more than princess, though she would be both of those things in the years to come. She was the living bridge between the world of the Amazons and the world of mortals, the hope that compassion might yet triumph over cruelty, that justice might yet prevail over oppression, that love might yet conquer the hatred that seemed to define so much of human existence. In her tiny hands rested possibilities that would reshape not only her own destiny, but the destiny of every living being who would cross her path in the epic journey that lay ahead. The clay from which she had been formed remained part of her essential nature, a reminder that even the most exalted beings began from humble origins, and that true nobility came not from birth or circumstance, but from the choices made in moments of trial and testing. Yet she was also blessed with divine essence that would grant her capabilities far beyond those of ordinary mortals, powers that would enable her to stand against forces that threatened not just individual lives, but the very principles that made existence meaningful and worthwhile. As Queen Hippolyta held her newborn daughter beneath the star-filled sky of Themyscira, she could not have known that she held in her arms the future Wonder Woman, the champion who would one day bridge the gap between her perfect world and the flawed but worthy world of humanity. Yet she understood with perfect clarity that this child represented something unprecedented and precious, a gift from the gods that carried with it both infinite promise and infinite responsibility. The years that followed Diana's miraculous birth were marked by a peace so profound and complete that even the immortal Amazons, who had known centuries of tranquility, found themselves marveling at the harmony that seemed to emanate from their princess like ripples spreading across still water. The child who had been born from clay and divine blessing grew with a grace that transcended the merely physical, developing not only in strength and beauty, but in wisdom and compassion that seemed to flow from some inexhaustible wellspring within her young heart. Yet even in paradise, the passage of time brings change, and the day would inevitably come when the perfect isolation of Themyscira would be shattered by forces beyond the control of even the gods themselves. That day dawned clear and bright, with no hint of the momentous events that would unfold before the sun set upon a world forever changed by the collision between the realm of the Amazons and the war-torn domain of mortal men. The first sign of approaching transformation came not as thunder or earthquake, but as the distant drone of mechanical wings cutting through air that had known only the songs of birds and the whisper of sea breezes for 3,000 years. Captain Stephen Rockwell Trevor, United States Army Air Forces, was flying his experimental P-40 Warhawk fighter plane through coordinates that should have contained nothing but empty ocean when his instruments began to register impossible readings that defied every principle of navigation and meteorology he had learned in his years of military service. The storm that engulfed Trevor's aircraft was unlike anything recorded in the annals of human weather observation, a swirling vortex of forces that seemed to operate according to laws that transcended the merely physical. Lightning crackled with colors that had no names, and winds howled with voices that spoke in languages older than human civilization. The pilot found himself fighting, not merely for control of his machine, but for his very sanity, as reality itself seemed to bend and shift around him like a kaleidoscope of impossible geometries. When the storm finally released its grip upon his struggling aircraft, Trevor discovered that he was flying through skies so clear and blue that they seemed painted by divine hand, over waters that sparkled like liquid sapphire beneath a sun that shone with warmth and benevolence unknown in the world he had left behind. Below him stretched an island that appeared on no map ever drawn by a human cartographer, a realm of marble columns and golden beaches, of gardens that bloomed with eternal spring, and architecture that combined the finest achievements of classical civilization with something even more sublime. The crash that brought Trevor's journey to its violent conclusion was inevitable, for his damaged aircraft could not long maintain flight, even in the perfect skies above Themyscira. Yet, even as his plane spiraled toward the crystalline waters of Paradise Island's protected harbor, unseen hands seemed to guide its descent, ensuring that the impact, while dramatic, would not claim the life of the unexpected visitor who had somehow penetrated the mystical barriers that had protected the Amazon realm for millennia. Princess Diana, now grown to young womanhood with all the strength and beauty that her divine heritage promised, was the first to witness the arrival of this stranger from the outer world. She had been training with her sword instructor Philippus on the beach when the sound of screaming metal and the sight of smoke rising from the harbor drew her attention to an event that would define the remainder of her existence. Without hesitation, she plunged into the waves that others might have found treacherous, her Amazon training and divine gifts, allowing her to reach the sinking aircraft with speed that would have seemed impossible to mortal observers. The man she pulled from the wreckage was unlike anything Diana had ever seen or imagined, for her entire existence had been spent among the immortal women of Themyscira, and the concept of masculine humanity existed for her only as abstract knowledge gleaned from ancient texts and careful study of the world beyond their shores. Yet there was something in Stephen Trevor's face, even unconscious and pale from his ordeal, that spoke to her of nobility and courage, of a spirit that burned with dedication to principles that transcended personal safety or comfort. The rescue that Diana performed that day was more than the saving of a single life, though she could not have understood its full significance at the time. It was the first thread in a tapestry that would weave together two worlds that had remained separate since the dawn of recorded history, the beginning of a relationship between Amazon and mortal that would challenge every assumption about the nature of heroism, justice, and the eternal struggle between good and evil that defined existence in both realms. The debate that erupted among the Amazons when Diana brought the unconscious pilot to their shores was unlike any that had disturbed the harmony of Themyscira in living memory. For 3,000 years, they had maintained perfect isolation from the world of men, and the arrival of a male on their sacred island represented not merely an inconvenience, but a potential violation of the very principles upon which their society had been founded. Some argued for immediate expulsion, insisting that the man should be healed and return to his world with no memory of what he had witnessed. Others, moved by compassion and curiosity, suggested that his presence might represent an opportunity to learn about the changes that had occurred in the outer world during their long separation. Queen Hippolyta found herself torn between her responsibilities as ruler of the Amazons and her growing awareness that her daughter's rescue of the stranger had been no mere accident, but the fulfillment of ancient prophecies that spoke of a time when Paradise Island's isolation would end, and its greatest champion would venture forth to heal the wounds that scarred the world beyond their shores. The oracle stones, consulted by her wisest advisors, spoke in riddles and contradictions, offering guidance that seemed to point in multiple directions simultaneously. As Trevor slowly recovered from his injuries under the careful ministrations of Amazon healers whose knowledge of medicine far exceeded anything available in the mortal world, he began to speak of the war that raged across the continents he had left behind. His words painted a picture of human civilization, locked in a struggle of unprecedented scope and brutality, where entire nations had committed themselves to the destruction of their neighbors, and where technological marvels were twisted into instruments of mass death and suffering. The horror that filled Diana's heart as she listened to these accounts was unlike anything she had experienced in her sheltered existence on Paradise Island. The world that Trevor described seemed like a nightmare inversion of everything she had been taught about the potential nobility of human nature, a realm where the worst impulses of conscious beings had been given free rein to create suffering on a scale that challenged comprehension. Yet beneath her horror lay a growing conviction that such suffering could not be allowed to continue, that those who possessed the power to help had an obligation to intervene regardless of the personal cost. The debates between mother and daughter that followed Trevor's recovery were marked by a passion and intensity that surprised both participants. For Diana had always been the most dutiful and obedient of daughters, accepting her mother's wisdom without question or challenge. Yet the knowledge of the world's suffering had awakened something within the young Amazon that would not be silenced by appeals to tradition or safety, a sense of mission that transcended personal comfort or familial obligation. Hippolyta's arguments against involvement in the conflicts of the outer world were rooted in bitter experience and hard-won wisdom, for the Amazons had once lived among mortals and had suffered betrayal and persecution that had driven them to seek refuge on Themyscira in the first place. The world of men, she insisted, was beyond redemption, trapped in cycles of violence and hatred that no external intervention could break. The Amazons' responsibility was to preserve their own purity and wisdom, not to sacrifice themselves in futile attempts to reform those who had already chosen the paths of darkness. Yet Diana's counter-arguments were equally compelling, drawing upon the very values and principles that Queen Hippolyta had instilled in her daughter from earliest childhood. If the Amazons possessed the power to alleviate suffering and chose not to act, what did that say about their commitment to justice and compassion? If they allowed evil to triumph through their inaction, how were they different from those who actively participated in creating that evil? The gifts they had received from the gods, Diana insisted, came with obligations that extended beyond the boundaries of Paradise Island. The solution that emerged from these passionate debates was one that honored both the wisdom of experience and the demands of conscience, though it satisfied neither mother nor daughter completely. The Amazons would hold a contest to determine who among them was most worthy to escort Trevor back to his world and to assess whether any assistance could be provided in the conflicts that consumed human civilization. The winner would serve as their ambassador to the outer world, carrying with her the hopes and values of Themyscira, while maintaining the option of withdrawal if the mission proved impossible or too dangerous. The contest, announced by Queen Hippolyta, drew participants from across the full spectrum of Amazon society, for many of her sisters had been moved by Trevor's accounts of suffering and felt called to offer their services in the cause of justice. The competitions were designed to test not only physical prowess, but wisdom, compassion, and the ability to maintain Amazon principles, even under the most challenging circumstances. Archery and sword work, racing and wrestling, tests of logic and moral reasoning, all combined to identify the Amazon most capable of serving as their representative in a world that had forgotten the very meaning of the values they held most sacred. The prohibition that Queen Hippolyta placed upon her daughter's participation in the contest was motivated by love and fear in equal measure, for she understood that Diana's compassionate nature and sense of justice made her the most likely candidate to succeed in such a mission, but also the most likely to sacrifice herself in service of others who might not prove worthy of such sacrifice. The mother's heart that had yearned for a child for 3 millennia was not prepared to risk losing that child to the dangers of a world that had already demonstrated its capacity for corruption and destruction. Yet Diana's decision to enter the contest despite her mother's explicit prohibition was not an act of rebellion, but rather the inevitable result of the values and training that Hippolyta herself had provided throughout her daughter's upbringing. The young Amazon could not reconcile her mother's teachings about justice and compassion with a command to ignore the suffering of innocents, nor could she accept that her unique gifts and divine heritage were meant to be hoarded rather than shared with those who needed them most desperately. The disguise that Diana adopted for the contest was more than mere physical concealment, for it required her to suppress the very essence of her identity and compete as if she were merely another Amazon warrior rather than the princess whose every movement had been watched and guided since birth. The golden helmet that concealed her distinctive features also symbolized her willingness to sacrifice her privileged position and accept the same risks and challenges that faced any other participant in the competition. The victories that Diana achieved in contest after contest were marked by a grace and power that impressed even the most experienced Amazon warriors, yet none suspected that they were witnessing their beloved princess, demonstrating the full extent of abilities that had been developing in secret for years. Her archery was precise beyond measurement, her sword work flowed like a deadly dance, her racing seemed to bend the very air around her, and her wrestling combined strength with technique in ways that honored the finest traditions of Amazon combat training. The final challenge of the contest was designed not to test physical capabilities, but moral courage, requiring each remaining participant to confront a scenario in which personal safety conflicted with the welfare of innocents, in which the easy path led to comfort, while the difficult path led to sacrifice. Diana's response to this challenge revealed not only her worthiness to serve as Amazon ambassador, but the depth of character that would define her heroic career in the years to come. She chose sacrifice without hesitation, demonstrating that her commitment to justice transcended all personal considerations. The revelation of Diana's identity when she removed the golden helmet after her victory was greeted with a mixture of pride and dismay by the assembled Amazons, pride in their princess's obvious worthiness for the mission ahead, and dismay at the realization that their most precious daughter would soon be leaving the safety of Paradise Island for dangers that none of them could fully anticipate. Queen Hippolyta's response combined a mother's natural fear with a ruler's recognition that the contest had been fairly won, and that her daughter's victory represented the will of the gods themselves. The preparation for Diana's departure from Themyscira involved not only practical considerations of equipment and supplies, but the forging of artifacts that would serve as both tools and symbols of her Amazon heritage. The lasso created from the golden girdle of Gaia was imbued with the power to compel truth from any being who felt its touch, ensuring that lies and deceptions would hold no power over the Amazon princess. The silver bracelets forged from the chains that had once bound the gods themselves would deflect any weapon turned against her, while serving as constant reminders of the responsibility that came with power. The costume that would become iconic across the world was designed to honor both Diana's Amazon heritage and her mission as ambassador to the realm of mortals. The red, gold, and blue combined the colors of both her homeland and the nation to which she was traveling, while the eagle that adorned her chest symbolized the freedom and nobility that she hoped to inspire in all those she encountered. Every element of her appearance was carefully considered to project strength and compassion in equal measure, to announce to the world that a new kind of hero had arrived. The invisible plane that would carry Diana from Paradise Island to the world of men was itself a marvel that combined Amazon craftsmanship with divine blessing, a vehicle capable of traversing not only the physical distances between worlds, but the spiritual and philosophical chasms that separated their very different approaches to existence. Its transparency symbolized the honesty and openness that Diana would bring to her mission, while its speed and maneuverability ensured that she would be able to respond quickly to crises wherever they might arise. The farewell between mother and daughter that took place on the shores of Themyscira carried emotional weight that neither fully comprehended at the time, for they were saying goodbye not only to each other, but to an entire phase of existence that could never be recovered or repeated. Diana was leaving behind the perfect safety and harmony of Paradise Island for a world of moral ambiguity and physical danger, while Hippolyta was accepting that her role as mother would now be shared with an entire world that would look to her daughter for guidance and protection. The final gifts bestowed upon Diana before her departure were not material objects, but blessings and wisdom that would guide her through the challenges ahead. The blessing of Aphrodite ensured that love would always triumph over hatred in her heart, while Athena's blessing provided the wisdom to distinguish between justice and vengeance. Artemis contributed the courage to face any enemy, while Demeter offered the assurance that she would always find strength in her connection to the natural world and the innocent creatures it sustained. As Diana rose into the sky above Themyscira in her invisible plane, carrying with her the hopes and dreams of an entire civilization, she could not have imagined the scope of the mission that lay before her, or the ways in which her intervention would reshape not only the world of mortals, but her own understanding of what it meant to be a hero. The clay-born princess was about to become Wonder Woman, though she would not claim that title until events in the world beyond Paradise Island demanded a name that could inspire hope in the darkest hours of human history. The transformation from sheltered princess to warrior diplomat was already beginning as Diana flew through skies that grew darker and more turbulent with each mile that separated her from the mystical protections of her homeland. The innocence that had defined her existence on Paradise Island would soon be tested against realities that no amount of training or preparation could fully anticipate. Yet the divine essence that flowed through her clay-formed body ensured that she would meet every challenge with courage and compassion intact. The world that awaited Diana's arrival was one where the very concepts of heroism and justice had been distorted by years of warfare and suffering, where the distinction between friend and enemy had been blurred by propaganda and desperation, where the innocent and guilty alike suffered under the weight of conflicts they had neither chosen nor could easily escape. It would be a world that would test every principle she held, sacred and force her to discover reserves of strength and wisdom that she had never known she possessed. Yet it would also be a world ready for the kind of hope that only she could provide. A realm of beings who had nearly forgotten that alternatives to hatred and violence existed, who desperately needed to be reminded that compassion was strength rather than weakness, and that justice was possible even in the darkest times. The clay-born daughter of paradise was about to begin her greatest adventure, one that would transform her from princess to legend and establish her as the eternal champion of truth and justice for all the worlds that needed such protection. The world that Diana entered as she descended from the pristine skies above Themyscira into the smoke-darkened atmosphere of a civilization at war was so fundamentally different from everything she had known that her first moments in the realm of mortals left her reeling with sensory overload and emotional devastation. The air itself seemed poisoned with the acrid smoke of burning cities and the metallic taste of spilled blood, while sounds that had no equivalent in her experience assaulted her enhanced hearing with their cacophony of mechanical destruction and human anguish. The London of 1941 that greeted Diana's arrival was a city transformed by the crucible of total warfare, where the elegant Georgian architecture she had studied in Amazon libraries stood scarred and broken beneath the relentless assault of German bombers, where the Thames reflected not the gentle light of peaceful commerce, but the hellish glow of fires that burned day and night across the metropolitan landscape. The civilians she encountered in those first bewildering hours moved through their devastated streets with a mixture of determination and desperation that spoke to reserves of courage she had never imagined ordinary mortals could possess. The shock of witnessing human suffering on such a scale was compounded by Diana's growing understanding of the systematic nature of the destruction, the realization that these were not natural disasters or accidents, but the deliberate product of conscious choices made by beings who possessed the same essential nature as the victims they were destroying. The concept of warfare, as she had studied it in Amazon texts, had always carried undertones of nobility and honor, conflicts between opposing principles that could be resolved through superior skill and moral clarity. The reality of modern mechanized slaughter challenged every assumption she had formed about the nature of human conflict. Her first attempt to intervene in the violence she witnessed was motivated by pure instinct and Amazon training. The sight of German Stukas diving toward a children's hospital triggering responses that had been programmed into her very essence by decades of preparation for exactly such moments. The bullets that should have torn through her flesh bounced harmlessly from her Amazon bracelets, while her strength allowed her to redirect falling bombs and collapsing buildings in ways that saved lives, but also announced to everyone present that something unprecedented had entered their war-torn world. The initial reactions of both civilians and military personnel to Diana's public display of superhuman abilities revealed the complex mixture of hope and fear that would characterize humanity's relationship with superheroes for generations to come. Some saw in her intervention the hand of divine providence, proof that God had not abandoned them in their darkest hour, and that forces beyond human understanding were working on behalf of the innocent and oppressed. Others reacted with suspicion and terror, unable to distinguish between miraculous salvation and supernatural threat, viewing her abilities as potentially more dangerous than the conventional weapons they already faced. The establishment of her civilian identity as Diana Prince required navigation of bureaucratic and social complexities that her Paradise Island upbringing had never prepared her to handle. Yet, the natural intelligence enhanced by Athena's blessing enabled her to adapt with remarkable speed to customs and expectations that initially seemed as alien as the language itself. The concept of employment for wages was foreign to someone raised in a society where contribution to the common good was its own reward. Yet she quickly recognized the necessity of establishing legitimate credentials that would allow her to move freely through a world governed by documents and official permissions. Her position with the War Department, arranged through connections that Steve Trevor maintained despite the skepticism of his superiors regarding his account of Paradise Island and its inhabitants, provided her with access to intelligence about German operations, while also exposing her to the full scope of the conflict that was consuming European civilization. The reports that crossed her desk each day painted a picture of destruction and suffering that stretched from the frozen battlefields of Russia to the burning deserts of North Africa, from the submarine-infested waters of the Atlantic to the bombed-out cities of Britain itself. The friendship that developed between Diana and Etta Candy represented her first meaningful relationship with an ordinary human being, someone whose courage and loyalty were remarkable not because they were enhanced by divine blessing, but because they emerged from simple moral choice and strength of character. Etta's work coordinating relief efforts for bombing victims brought Diana into contact with the kind of individual heroism that characterized ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, the quiet bravery of those who chose to help others, despite having no special powers or protections. Through Etta's introduction to the Holiday Girls, the group of young women who had organized themselves into an unofficial intelligence network supporting Allied operations, Diana began to understand the complex ways in which warfare affected civilian populations and the crucial roles played by those who never wore uniforms or carried weapons, but whose contributions proved essential to the survival of their societies. The Holiday Girls' combination of patriotic dedication and individual initiative reminded her of the Amazon sisterhood, though their mortality and vulnerability made their courage even more impressive than that of her immortal sisters. The evolution of Diana's relationship with Steve Trevor from gratitude for his rescue to something deeper and more complex was complicated by the fundamental differences in their natures and backgrounds, yet also strengthened by their shared commitment to principles that transcended personal safety and comfort. Trevor's dedication to duty and his willingness to risk his life for causes greater than himself resonated with values that had been central to Diana's upbringing, while his very human struggles with fear and doubt helped her understand the true meaning of mortal courage. The first time Diana used the name Wonder Woman was not a deliberate choice, but rather an spontaneous response to a reporter's question about the mysterious figure who had been witnessed performing impossible feats of strength and speed in defense of London's civilian population. The name captured something essential about the awe and hope that her presence inspired in those who witnessed her actions, while also establishing an identity that could serve as a symbol of resistance against the forces of tyranny and oppression that threatened to extinguish the light of civilization itself. Her early battles against conventional German forces provided valuable lessons about the limitations of superhuman abilities when confronted with the organized malevolence of modern warfare. For no amount of individual strength could be everywhere at once or prevent all the suffering that resulted from conflicts involving millions of participants across multiple continents. The rescue of a single bombed building meant little when dozens of others were being destroyed simultaneously, and the defeat of one submarine or bomber squadron had minimal impact on the vast machines of destruction that the warring nations had constructed. The gradual realization that her most effective contributions lay not in direct combat, but in striking at the sources and symbols of the conflict that was consuming human civilization, led Diana to focus her efforts on targets whose elimination would have strategic, rather than merely tactical, significance. The Nazi research facilities that were developing new forms of chemical and biological warfare, the leadership structures that coordinated genocide and systematic oppression, the propaganda networks that spread hatred and fear among populations that might otherwise have chosen peace over violence. Her first encounter with Dr. Isabel Maru, the The brilliant chemist whose perverted genius had created weapons that killed with unprecedented efficiency and cruelty, provided Diana with her first glimpse of how individual human choice could amplify suffering far beyond what any single person should be capable of causing. Maru's dedication to her destructive research was motivated not by ideology or patriotism, but by intellectual pride and the satisfaction of solving technical challenges, regardless of the human cost of her solutions. The horror that Diana felt when she witnessed the effects of Maru's chemical weapons on both soldiers and civilians forced her to confront the reality that evil was not always the product of external corruption or supernatural influence, but could emerge from the conscious choices of beings who possessed the same essential nature as their victims. The sight of children dying from poison gas attacks challenged every assumption she had formed about the inherent goodness of human nature and the possibility of redemption for those who chose to inflict such suffering. Yet, it was in her confrontation with General Erich Ludendorff, the German officer whose fanatical determination to continue the war had led him to embrace the most extreme methods available to achieve victory, regardless of cost, that Diana began to understand the deeper forces that were shaping the conflict she had entered. Ludendorff's enhancement with experimental stimulants had granted him strength and endurance that approached superhuman levels, yet it was his unwavering commitment to a cause he believed justified any sacrifice that made him truly dangerous. The battle between Diana and Ludendorff that raged across the chemical weapons facility where Maru conducted her research was notable not only for the physical destruction it caused, but for the philosophical debate that accompanied their combat, as each combatant sought to justify their actions according to principles they held sacred. Ludendorff's arguments about the necessity of total commitment to achieve victory resonated with aspects of Amazon warrior culture, yet his willingness to sacrifice innocence in pursuit of strategic goals violated every moral boundary that Diana's upbringing had established. The revelation that Ludendorff's enhancement came from chemicals developed by Dr. Luden, Maru created a direct connection between the individual evil she had witnessed in the laboratory and the systemic violence that was consuming European civilization, demonstrating how personal choices to embrace corruption could amplify into consequences that affected millions of people. The destruction of Maru's research and the defeat of Ludendorff represented victories against specific manifestations of evil, yet Diana's growing awareness of the war's complexity suggested that such tactical successes were insufficient to address the deeper problems. The appearance of Ares himself on the battlefield, where Diana had just achieved victory over seemingly mortal enemies, transformed her understanding of the conflict from a purely human tragedy into a cosmic struggle between fundamental forces of creation and destruction. The god of war's revelation that he had been subtly influencing human decisions throughout the conflict, amplifying existing tendencies toward violence and hatred, while offering technological advances that made destruction more efficient and widespread, recontextualized everything Diana had witnessed since leaving Paradise Island. Ares' arguments about the essential nature of humanity, his insistence that mortals were inherently drawn to violence and destruction, and that his influence merely accelerated processes that would occur naturally given sufficient time, challenged Diana's fundamental beliefs about the possibility of redemption and the value of her mission. The gods claim that he was actually performing a mercy by ending human suffering through the complete elimination of the species, forced her to confront questions about the meaning of compassion and the responsibilities that came with power. The philosophical debate between Diana and Ares that preceded their physical confrontation encompassed questions that had occupied human thinkers for millennia, exploring the nature of evil and the possibility of moral progress, while the fate of human civilization hung in the balance. Ares' demonstration of humanity's capacity for cruelty, His catalogue of historical atrocities and contemporary horrors provided compelling evidence for his pessimistic assessment of mortal nature. Yet Diana's own experiences with individual humans like Steve Trevor and Etta Candy offered equally compelling counter-evidence. The battle itself transcended the merely physical, becoming a contest between competing visions of reality and different understandings of what conscious existence could become under proper guidance and inspiration. Diana's strength, enhanced by her divine heritage and Amazon training, proved sufficient to match Ares in direct combat. Yet, it was her unwavering commitment to the possibility of human goodness that provided the spiritual power necessary to overcome a being whose cynicism had been reinforced by millennia of witnessing mortal cruelty and stupidity. The moment of Ares' defeat came not through superior force, but through Diana's demonstration of the very qualities the god had claimed were impossible for mortals to sustain. Her willingness to sacrifice herself to protect people who had given her no reason to expect gratitude or loyalty. The love that powered her final assault against the god of war was not romantic attachment or familial obligation, but something far more universal and transformative. The recognition that all conscious beings possessed inherent worth that justified any risk or sacrifice necessary to preserve it. The aftermath of Ares' destruction brought not the immediate end to warfare that Diana had hoped for, but rather a more gradual recognition among the combatants that the supernatural influences that had made their conflict so vicious and intractable were no longer operating. The armistice that followed came not from divine intervention but from human choice, the collective decision by exhausted populations and their leaders that the costs of continued fighting exceeded any possible benefits that victory might bring. Diana's role in the peace negotiations that followed the war's end was necessarily limited by her unofficial status and the need to maintain her civilian identity. Yet her influence was felt in the emphasis on reconciliation and reconstruction rather than revenge and punishment that characterized the most successful aspects of the post-war settlement. Her advocacy for treating former enemies as future partners, rather than permanent threats, reflected lessons learned through her confrontation with Ares about the cyclical nature of hatred and the importance of breaking patterns of retribution. The establishment of Diana's permanent residence in the world of mortals represented not an abandonment of her Amazon heritage, but rather an expansion of her mission to encompass responsibilities that could not be fulfilled through temporary visits or emergency interventions. The recognition that human civilization required ongoing protection and guidance led her to accept that her role as bridge between Themyscira and the outside world would be a permanent rather than temporary assignment. The creation of her Wonder Woman persona as a symbol of hope and inspiration for those who struggled against oppression and injustice marked her transition from refugee from Paradise Island to permanent advocate for the principles that both civilizations held sacred. The costume that had been designed to serve diplomatic purposes evolved into something more profound, a visual representation of the possibility that strength and compassion could coexist, that power could serve justice rather than self-interest. The early years of Diana's career as Wonder Woman were marked by efforts to apply the lessons learned during the Great War to the smaller conflicts and individual acts of evil that continued to plague human society even after the larger mechanisms of systematic destruction had been dismantled. Bank robberies and kidnappings, political corruption and organized crime, domestic violence and child abuse, all fell within her expanding definition of injustices that required intervention by those capable of providing it. Yet, it was her growing understanding of the systemic nature of many social problems that led Diana to recognize that superhuman strength and speed were insufficient tools for addressing issues that required changes in law and custom. education, and economic opportunity. Her work with women's rights organizations and peace advocacy groups demonstrated that some battles could only be won through patient effort to change minds and hearts rather than direct confrontation with obvious enemies. The loneliness that Diana experienced as the only being of her kind in a world of mortals was partially alleviated by the friendships she formed with humans who shared her commitment to justice and truth. Yet the fundamental differences in their natures and lifespans ensured that such relationships would always be shadowed by the awareness of their temporary nature. The immortal perspective that was part of her divine heritage made it difficult to form attachments that she knew would inevitably end in loss and grief. The letters that Diana exchanged with her mother during these early years in the world of men provided an outlet for thoughts and emotions that could not be safely shared with mortal companions. Yet they also revealed the growing distance between daughter and mother as their experiences diverged along paths that could never converge. Hippolyta's concerns about the corrupting influence of extended contact with mortal society were balanced by her pride in Diana's achievements and her recognition that the mission her daughter had undertaken was both necessary and successful. The development of Diana's relationships with other extraordinary individuals who had chosen to dedicate their lives to the protection of innocent people led to informal networks of cooperation that would eventually evolve into more structured alliances between heroes who shared common values and compatible methods. These early collaborations provided valuable lessons about the strengths and limitations of both individual and group approaches to crime fighting and social justice. The public's evolving reaction to Wonder Woman's activities reflected broader changes in society's relationship with authority and power, as populations that had recently witnessed the devastating consequences of unchecked governmental control learned to distinguish between strength used for domination and strength used for protection. The trust that gradually developed between Diana and the communities she served was based not on her power alone, but on the consistent demonstration that her abilities would never be used for personal gain or political advantage. The emergence of enemies who possessed capabilities that matched or exceeded her own forced Diana to develop new strategies and techniques that emphasized intelligence and preparation, rather than relying solely on superior physical abilities. The realization that she could not simply overpower every threat required her to become a more complete hero, one whose arsenal included diplomacy and detective work alongside strength and speed. The philosophical evolution that Diana underwent during her first years as Wonder Woman reflected the ongoing tension between her Amazon idealism and her growing understanding of the complexity and ambiguity that characterized most real-world moral decisions. The clear distinctions between good and evil that had seemed so obvious during her confrontation with Ares became increasingly blurred as she encountered situations where well-intentioned people found themselves on opposite sides of conflicts that had no perfect solutions. Yet it was precisely this growing sophistication in her understanding of moral complexity that made Diana a more effective champion of justice. For her ability to recognize the humanity in her enemies while maintaining unwavering commitment to protecting their victims allowed her to find solutions that pure force could never achieve. The Claiborne princess had become something unprecedented in human experience, a being of godlike power who retained the capacity for growth and change that made her truly wise rather than merely strong. The years that followed the Great War's end brought not the permanent peace that Diana had hoped to achieve through her defeat of Ares, but rather a complex period of reconstruction and transformation that would test her understanding of heroism in ways that direct combat never could. The world of the 1950s and 60s that emerged from the ashes of global conflict was marked by technological marvels that promised to elevate human civilization to unprecedented heights, yet also shadowed by new forms of fear and suspicion that threatened to divide nations and peoples. along ideological lines, as rigid as any that had separated wartime enemies. The dawn of the atomic age brought with it possibilities for both creation and destruction on scales that dwarfed even the mechanized slaughter Diana had witnessed during the war, forcing her to confront the reality that human ingenuity could amplify both the noblest aspirations and the darkest impulses of conscious beings. The same scientific knowledge that promised unlimited energy and the conquest of disease could also produce weapons capable of rendering entire continents uninhabitable, while the same communication technologies that might unite the world's peoples were being employed to spread propaganda and hatred with unprecedented efficiency. Diana's role during these transformative decades evolved from that of wartime champion to something more complex and multifaceted, as she found herself serving simultaneously as protector, diplomat, teacher, and symbol in a world that seemed perpetually balanced on the edge between progress and catastrophe. The costume that had once marked her as an agent of military intervention against fascist aggression was increasingly seen as a beacon of hope for those who struggled against subtler forms of oppression and injustice that could not be defeated through strength alone. The formation of the Justice Society of America represented Diana's first formal alliance with other extraordinary individuals who had chosen to dedicate their abilities to the protection of innocent people. Yet the organization's early structure reflected the social assumptions of its era in ways that would seem incomprehensible to later generations. Despite her obvious qualifications and demonstrated heroism, Diana found herself relegated to the role of secretary rather than full member, a position that spoke more to contemporary attitudes about gender roles than to any objective assessment of her capabilities or contributions. The irony that someone who could deflect bullets and defeat gods was expected to take notes and serve coffee was not lost on Diana, yet her response to this diminished status revealed the diplomatic wisdom that had been developing since her first encounters with human society. Rather than confronting the injustice directly through displays of superior power, she chose to work within the system, while gradually demonstrating that such artificial limitations serve no useful purpose and actually weaken the organization's effectiveness. The adventures that Diana shared with her Justice Society colleagues during these formative years of organized superheroism provided valuable lessons about the strengths and limitations of group dynamics in addressing complex threats that exceeded the capacity of individual heroes to handle alone. The telepathic coordination that Jay Garrick could provide with his super speed, the mystical insights offered by Dr. Fate, the detective skills contributed by the original Sandman, all complemented Diana's own abilities in ways that created synergistic effects greater than the sum of their individual parts. Yet, it was her encounters with the emerging rogues gallery of supervillains who began to plague American society during this period that provided Diana with her most significant challenges and her greatest opportunities for growth as a hero. Unlike the ideologically motivated enemies she had faced during wartime, these new adversaries were driven by psychological complexes and personal obsessions that required different approaches and different solutions than those that had proven effective against conventional military targets. The first appearance of Dr. Psycho in Diana's life marked the beginning of her ongoing confrontation with enemies who sought to undermine rather than overpower her. Villains whose primary weapons were manipulation and deception rather than brute force or advanced technology. The diminutive psychiatrist's ability to control minds and create elaborate illusions posed threats that could not be countered through superior strength or speed, forcing Diana to develop new techniques that emphasized mental discipline and emotional stability rather than physical prowess. The psychological warfare that Dr. Psycho employed against Diana was particularly insidious because it targeted her greatest strengths and attempted to transform them into weaknesses using her compassion against her by creating scenarios where any action she took would result in suffering for innocent people. The illusions he crafted were designed not merely to confuse her perception, but to undermine her confidence in her own judgment and her faith in the values that had guided her since leaving Paradise Island. The recurring nature of her conflicts with Dr. Psycho forced Diana to confront questions about the nature of mental illness and the extent to which criminal behavior could be attributed to psychological disorders rather than moral choice. The psychiatrist's obvious brilliance and his genuine insights into human psychology were perversely coupled with a hatred of women so intense that it drove him to increasingly elaborate schemes of revenge against the gender he blamed for his own inadequacies and failures. The emergence of the cheetah as one of Diana's most persistent adversaries represented a different category of threat entirely. For Dr. E, Barbara Minerva had once been a colleague and potential friend whose transformation into a predatory monster was the result of choices made in pursuit of knowledge and power rather than simple malice or mental instability. The archaeological expedition that had led to Minerva's encounter with the plant god Urzkartaga had been motivated by legitimate scholarly curiosity, yet her willingness to sacrifice others to achieve her research goals revealed character flaws that the supernatural transformation would amplify into genuine evil. The tragedy of the cheetah was not merely personal, but represented a broader cautionary tale about the corruption of intellectual achievement when it was divorced from moral restraint and ethical consideration. Minerva's expertise in ancient languages and lost civilizations had made her one of the most respected scholars in her field. Yet her willingness to exploit indigenous peoples and desecrate sacred sites in pursuit of academic glory demonstrated that knowledge without wisdom could become a destructive force, as dangerous as any supervillain's weapon. The physical battles between Wonder Woman and the cheetah were notable for their savagery and intensity, as the transformed archaeologist's enhanced strength and speed were coupled with predatory instincts that made her one of the few enemies capable of matching Diana in direct combat. Yet the psychological dimension of their conflict was even more significant, for it forced Diana to confront the possibility that people she had considered friends and allies could be transformed into deadly enemies through choices that initially seemed motivated by understandable desires for knowledge and achievement. The introduction of Giganta as a recurring threat represented yet another variation on the theme of female villains whose criminal careers were motivated by jealousy and resentment toward Diana's achievements and social acceptance. Dr. Doris Yule's transformation from respected scientist to size-changing supervillain was precipitated by her inability to accept that her own limitations and character flaws were responsible for her professional and personal failures rather than some conspiracy against her by more successful women. The battles between Wonder Woman and Giganta that became regular spectacles in the skies above major American cities were visually dramatic contests between opposing philosophies as much as they were physical confrontations between enhanced beings. Giganta's use of her size-changing abilities to terrorize innocent civilians while demanding recognition and respect represented the corruption of legitimate desires for achievement into destructive narcissism that could only be satisfied through the suffering of others. The recurring theme that emerged from Diana's encounters with these female adversaries was the recognition that the same social pressures and limitations that had once confined all women to restrictive roles could produce very different responses depending upon the character and choices of the individuals involved. While Diana had channeled her frustrations with gender-based discrimination into efforts to expand opportunities for all women, Her enemies had chosen to express their anger through attacks on other women who had achieved the success they felt they deserved. The expansion of Diana's activities beyond simple crime fighting to encompass broader social advocacy and diplomatic work reflected her growing understanding that many of the problems she encountered as Wonder Woman were symptoms of deeper systemic issues that could not be resolved through the defeat of individual villains. Her appointment as a special ambassador to the United Nations provided her with a platform for addressing issues of global significance, while also allowing her to work within established international frameworks, rather than operating as a vigilante. The challenges of balancing her superhero activities with her diplomatic responsibilities required Diana to develop new skills in negotiation and compromise that complemented her existing abilities in combat and investigation. The delicate work of mediating between conflicting national interests and ideological positions demanded a different kind of strength than that required to defeat supervillains, one that emphasized patience and understanding, rather than decisive action and moral clarity. The emergence of the Cold War as the defining geopolitical reality of the post-war era created particular difficulties for Diana's diplomatic work, as her commitment to truth and justice often conflicted with the pragmatic necessities of alliance, politics, and intelligence operations. The pressure to choose sides in the ideological struggle between democracy and communism was complicated by her recognition that both systems contained elements of wisdom and elements of corruption that could not be easily separated or simply condemned. Her encounters with Soviet superhumans who had been created by communist governments as counterparts to American heroes forced Diana to confront questions about the relationship between political systems and moral behavior that had no easy answers. The Red Guardian and other Eastern Bloc champions were motivated by genuine patriotism and sincere belief in their cause. Yet they served regimes that employed methods and pursued goals that violated many of the principles Diana held most sacred. The space race that captured global imagination during the 1950s and 60s provided Diana with opportunities to demonstrate that her abilities extended far beyond terrestrial conflicts, as her invulnerability and flight capabilities made her uniquely qualified to investigate extraterrestrial phenomena and respond to threats that originated beyond Earth's atmosphere. Her first encounters with alien civilizations revealed the existence of galactic communities and interstellar conflicts that dwarfed human problems in scope and complexity. The discovery that Earth was not unique in harboring intelligent life, and that many other worlds had produced beings with abilities similar or superior to her own, was simultaneously humbling and inspiring for Diana. The recognition that the universe contained countless civilizations, struggling with questions of justice and morality, provided her with a broader perspective on her own mission, while also revealing the cosmic significance of the principles she championed. Her involvement in the early adventures of the Justice League of America marked a new phase in Diana's heroic career, as the organization's more egalitarian structure allowed her to participate as a full member rather than being relegated to support roles. The expanded roster of heroes that included Superman, Batman, Green Lantern, The Flash, and Aquaman created opportunities for collaborative approaches to threats that exceeded the capabilities of any individual member. The dynamics of the Justice League's formation and early operations revealed both the potential and the limitations of superhero teamwork, as personalities and methods that worked effectively in solo operations sometimes clashed when applied in group settings. Diana's role as a mediator and voice of reason within the team reflected her diplomatic experience and her ability to see multiple perspectives on complex issues. Yet it also sometimes put her in conflict with colleagues who preferred more direct approaches to problem solving. The romantic entanglements that became an increasingly prominent aspect of Diana's civilian life during this period reflected both her growing integration into human society and the unique challenges faced by an immortal being in forming lasting relationships with mortals. Her connection with Steve Trevor had evolved from gratitude and partnership into something deeper and more complex. Yet, their relationship was continually complicated by the demands of their respective careers and the fundamental differences in their natures and lifespans. The question of whether Diana could or should form permanent romantic attachments with mortal men became a source of ongoing internal conflict that influenced many of her personal decisions during these decades. The knowledge that any relationship she formed would inevitably end with the death of her partner created a psychological barrier that was difficult to overcome, even when her feelings might otherwise have led her toward deeper commitment. The emergence of new technologies and scientific discoveries that seemed to blur the boundaries between the possible and the impossible required Diana to continually reassess her understanding of the natural world and her own place within it. The development of atomic energy, space travel, computer technology, and genetic engineering all suggested that human civilization was approaching capabilities that had once been the exclusive province of gods and other supernatural beings. Her encounters with time travel and parallel dimensions during various Justice League adventures forced Diana to confront the possibility that reality itself was far more complex and mutable than even her Amazon education had suggested. The existence of alternate timelines, where different choices had led to radically different outcomes, raised profound questions about the nature of destiny and the significance of individual moral decisions. The gradual revelation that her own origins were more complex and mysterious than she had originally understood added personal dimensions to these philosophical questions about the nature of reality and identity. The suggestion that her clay-based creation might have involved forces and purposes beyond those acknowledged by Queen Hippolyta introduced elements of uncertainty into her understanding of her own mission and destiny. The social changes that swept through American and global society during the 1960s created new opportunities and new challenges for Diana's work as both Wonder Woman and Diana Prince. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the anti-war movement, and other campaigns for social justice aligned with many of her fundamental values. Yet her position as a public figure and government liaison required careful navigation of political sensitivities and competing interests. Her support for women's rights and gender equality was both personal and philosophical, rooted in her own experiences of discrimination and her Amazon heritage of female empowerment. Yet her approach emphasized education and persuasion rather than confrontation. The recognition that lasting social change required shifts in consciousness and culture rather than simple legal mandates influenced her methods and her choice of allies in these struggles. The emergence of a new generation of superheroes and supervillains who reflected the social upheavals and cultural conflicts of their era required Diana to serve increasingly as a mentor and guide for younger heroes who lacked her experience and perspective. The responsibility of training and advising newcomers to the superhero community added another dimension to her already complex role as protector, diplomat, and social advocate. The evolution of her costume and equipment during this period reflected both practical considerations about effectiveness in combat and symbolic considerations about her public image and the messages she sought to convey. The modifications that updated her appearance while maintaining connection to her classical origins demonstrated her ability to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential aspects of her identity and mission. The expansion of her mythology and supporting cast during these decades created a richer and more complex narrative framework that better reflected the scope and significance of her role in human civilization. The introduction of characters like I Ching, who served as martial arts instructor and philosophical guide during her temporary loss of powers, demonstrated that even beings of godlike abilities could benefit from continued learning and growth. The periodic crises that threatened not merely individual cities or nations, but the entire fabric of reality itself, revealed the cosmic significance of the principles that Diana championed and the universal applicability of the values she had learned on Paradise Island. Her participation in battles against entities like the Anti-Monitor and Krona demonstrated that the struggle between creation and destruction, order and chaos, was not limited to any single world or dimension, but was fundamental to the nature of existence itself. The recognition that her mission extended beyond Earth to encompass the entire universe of conscious beings who struggled with questions of justice and morality provided Diana with a sense of purpose that transcended personal fulfillment or individual achievement. The Claiborne princess, who had once questioned her place in the world, had become a cosmic champion whose influence would be felt across galaxies and throughout eternity. The period that began in the late 1960s and extended through the transformative decade of the 70s represented perhaps the most challenging chapter in Diana's long existence, a time when the very foundations of her identity and mission would be tested through circumstances that stripped away not only her powers, but her sense of purpose and connection to the divine forces that had shaped her since birth. The crisis that precipitated this dark night of the soul emerged not from external enemies or cosmic threats, but from the complex interplay of personal choice, mystical law, and the inevitable consequences of living as an immortal being in a world of constant change. The decision that would alter the course of Diana's existence began with what appeared to be a routine crisis, another in the endless series of threats that required Wonder Woman's intervention to prevent catastrophe and protect innocent lives. The cult of fanatics who had seized control of a nuclear facility in the American Southwest possessed both the technical knowledge and the fanatical dedication necessary to transform their hostages and their atomic materials into a weapon capable of rendering vast areas of the continent uninhabitable for centuries to come. The mystical dimensions of this particular threat became apparent only as Diana approached the facility and felt her connection to the divine powers that enhanced her abilities begin to fluctuate in ways that had no precedent in her decades of heroic service. The cultists, led by a charismatic figure who claimed to channel the wisdom of ancient gods, had somehow tapped into energy patterns that interfered with the cosmic forces that flowed between Olympus and the mortal realm, creating distortions in the very fabric of reality that surrounded their stronghold. The battle that ensued challenged Diana in ways that pure physical combat never could, for she found herself fighting not only against armed fanatics, but against the gradual dissolution of the powers that had defined her existence since her clay-born creation on the shores of Paradise Island. Each use of her superhuman strength left her slightly weaker. Every deflection of bullets by her bracelets drained more of the divine energy that had once seemed inexhaustible, and her ability to fly became increasingly erratic as the mystical distortions intensified. The moment of choice that would define the next phase of Diana's existence came when she stood before the nuclear device that the cultists had prepared for detonation. Realizing that her failing powers were insufficient to disable the mechanism through conventional means, the only solution that presented itself required her to channel every remaining fragment of her divine heritage through her body to create an electromagnetic pulse powerful enough to destroy the weapon's delicate electronic systems, a process that would irrevocably sever her connection to the godly forces that had sustained her since birth. The sacrifice that Diana made in that crucial moment was not merely the loss of her superhuman abilities, but the abandonment of the very essence that had made her Wonder Woman, the divine spark that had elevated her from clay sculpture to living goddess. The electromagnetic explosion that disabled the nuclear device also burned away the mystical bonds that connected her to Mount Olympus, leaving her stranded in the mortal realm with nothing but her Amazon training and her unwavering commitment to justice to sustain her in the battles ahead. The disorientation that followed Diana's transformation from superhuman champion to merely human warrior was profound and multifaceted, affecting not only her physical capabilities but her sense of identity and purpose in ways that she had never imagined possible. The body that had once been invulnerable to conventional weapons now bled from minor cuts and bruises, while muscles that had once possessed the strength of gods now ached with the familiar limitations of mortal flesh. The psychological impact of this transformation proved even more challenging than the physical adjustments, for Diana had never fully comprehended how completely her self-image and her understanding of her role in the world had been dependent upon the supernatural gifts that were now forever beyond her reach. The confidence that had carried her through battles against gods and monsters was undermined by the recognition that she could no longer rely upon divine intervention to compensate for mistakes or miscalculations in judgment. The initial period of adjustment was marked by defeats and failures that would have been unthinkable during her years as Wonder Woman, as Diana struggled to recalibrate her fighting techniques and strategic thinking to account for her new limitations. Criminals who would once have posed no significant threat now represented genuine dangers that required careful planning and precise execution to overcome, while villains of moderate power levels became formidable opponents whose defeat demanded every skill she had acquired during decades of Amazon training. The intervention of I Ching in Diana's life during this darkest period represented a turning point that would ultimately prove more significant than any of the supernatural blessings she had previously received. Though she could not have recognized this truth in the depths of her despair and confusion, the elderly master of martial arts, who appeared in her life as if summoned by fate itself, possessed knowledge and wisdom that had been accumulated through purely human effort and dedication, achievements that gained rather than lost meaning from their mortal origins. The philosophy that I Ching brought to Diana's training extended far beyond the physical techniques of unarmed combat to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of strength and the sources of true power in a universe where conscious beings faced endless choices between creation and destruction. His teachings challenged her to reconsider assumptions about heroism that had been shaped by her godlike abilities, forcing her to discover forms of courage and effectiveness that emerged from character rather than supernatural gifts. The martial arts disciplines that Diana mastered under I Ching's patient guidance represented more than mere compensation for her lost superpowers, though they certainly provided practical techniques that enabled her to continue her mission of protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. The deeper value of this training lay in its revelation that human achievement could transcend apparent limitations through the application of wisdom, dedication, and moral clarity that no external force could grant or withdraw. The weapons mastery that became an essential component of Diana's new fighting style required her to develop relationships with tools and techniques that she had previously considered beneath the notice of someone who possessed divine strength and invulnerability. The sword that became her primary weapon was not enhanced by mystical properties or divine blessing, but relied upon the skill and precision of its wielder to achieve effectiveness against opponents who might possess technological or supernatural advantages. The psychological transformation that accompanied Diana's physical retraining was perhaps even more significant than the practical changes in her methods and capabilities, for it forced her to confront fundamental questions about identity and self-worth that she had never needed to examine during her years as Wonder Woman. The recognition that her value as a champion of justice did not depend upon her godlike abilities required a complete reconstruction of her understanding of what it meant to be a hero. The period of Diana's depowerment coincided with and was influenced by broader social and cultural changes that were transforming American society during the late 1960s and early 70s, as traditional assumptions about gender roles, authority structures, and social hierarchies were challenged by movements that demanded recognition of previously marginalized voices and perspectives. Her own struggle to define herself in purely human terms resonated with similar struggles being waged by women throughout the society she had sworn to protect. The feminist movement that gained momentum during this period provided Diana with new frameworks for understanding her mission and her identity that had been unavailable during her earlier career as a conventionally superpowered hero. The recognition that the most significant battles for justice were often fought not through dramatic confrontations with obvious villains, but through patient efforts to change systems and structures that perpetuated inequality, oppression aligned with her own evolving understanding of what heroism could accomplish. The adventures that Diana undertook during her depowered years were notable for their emphasis on investigation, strategy, and collaboration, rather than the direct confrontation and overwhelming force that had characterized her previous methods. The mysteries she solved and the conspiracies she unraveled required intellectual skills and emotional intelligence that her godlike powers had sometimes allowed her to bypass, forcing her to become a more complete and versatile champion of justice. The enemies she faced during this period posed threats that could not be overcome through superior strength or mystical abilities, but required understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and the complex motivations that drove individuals and organizations to choose evil over good. The corrupt politicians and corporate executives who became her primary adversaries during these years wielded power that derived from legal and economic structures rather than supernatural forces, making them both more dangerous and more difficult to defeat than conventional supervillains. The relationship that developed between Diana and I Ching transcended the traditional boundaries between teacher and student to encompass elements of partnership, friendship, and mutual respect that enriched both their lives in ways that neither had anticipated. The elderly master's own tragic history, marked by the loss of his monastery and the brutal murder of his fellow monks by agents of corruption and greed, provided him with personal understanding of the costs of fighting injustice that complemented Diana's more theoretical knowledge of evil's effects. The techniques that I Ching taught Diana were drawn not only from classical martial arts traditions, but from his own innovations and adaptations that reflected decades of practical experience in using human skills to overcome apparently superior opponents. His emphasis on turning an enemy's strength against them, on finding weakness within apparent invulnerability, on achieving victory through wisdom rather than force, provided her with strategic principles that would prove valuable long after her powers were eventually restored. The philosophical discussions that accompanied their physical training sessions explored questions about the nature of conflict and the meaning of victory that challenged many of Diana's previous assumptions about the heroic path. I Ching's Buddhist-influenced perspective on the interconnectedness of all conscious beings offered alternative approaches to dealing with enemies that emphasized redemption and understanding rather than simple defeat and punishment. The development of Diana's detective skills during this period reflected both practical necessity and the influence of her teacher's emphasis on understanding the deeper patterns and connections that linked seemingly separate events and individuals. The mysteries she solved often required her to trace complex webs of cause and effect that extended across decades and involved multiple layers of corruption and conspiracy. The technology and equipment that Diana learned to use during her depowered years represented a significant departure from the mystically enhanced artifacts that had previously served as her primary tools in the fight against evil. The motorcycles and aircraft that replaced her invisible plane were marvels of conventional engineering rather than divine craftsmanship, yet they provided mobility and effectiveness that proved adequate for her modified mission parameters. The costume changes that reflected Diana's new status as a purely human hero were symbolic as well as practical, abandoning the classical elements that had connected her to her Amazon heritage in favor of designs that emphasized functionality and freedom of movement rather than symbolic representation of divine authority. The white jumpsuit and jacket that became her signature look during this period projected an image of modern professionalism that aligned with her new role as an investigator and social activist. The loss of her lasso of truth forced Diana to develop alternative methods for compelling honesty from suspects and extracting information from reluctant sources, skills that relied upon psychological insight and interrogation techniques, rather than mystical compulsion. The recognition that truth-telling could be encouraged through building trust and demonstrating genuine concern for justice provided her with tools that were in some ways more effective than supernatural coercion. The crisis on Infinite Earths that eventually restored Diana's powers and fundamentally altered her origin story represented not merely a return to her previous capabilities, but a transformation that incorporated the wisdom and experience she had gained during her time as a purely human hero. The new version of Wonder Woman that emerged from this cosmic restructuring possessed not only her original divine gifts, but also the hard-won knowledge of what it meant to be vulnerable and mortal. The reinterpretation of her origin that followed the crisis revealed that her creation had been even more complex and significant than previously understood, involving not only the Olympian gods, but older and more fundamental forces that connected her to the very foundations of reality itself. The clay from which she had been formed was revealed to contain elements of the Earth's own consciousness, making her not merely an Amazon warrior blessed by the gods, but a living embodiment of the planet's own desire for justice and protection. The revelation that her period of depowerment had been not an accident or punishment, but a necessary phase in her development, added retrospective meaning to the suffering and confusion she had endured during those years. The trials she had faced as a mortal had been designed to teach her lessons about the nature of heroism that could not be learned through divine revelation or inherited wisdom, insights that could only be gained through personal experience of limitation and vulnerability. The restoration of her powers was accompanied by enhancements and new abilities that reflected both her expanded understanding of her mission and the cosmic significance of her role in the universal struggle between order and chaos. Her strength and speed were not merely returned, but increased to levels that exceeded her original capabilities, while her connection to the divine forces of creation was deepened and refined through her experience of their absence. The new lasso that replaced her original weapon was forged, not merely from golden materials, but from the very essence of truth itself, making it effective not only against conscious deception, but against self-delusion and the unconscious lies that beings told themselves to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities. The enhanced artifact reflected Diana's own growth in wisdom and understanding, becoming a tool for healing as well as investigation. The impact of George Perez's artistic vision on the reinvention of Wonder Woman's mythology created a visual language that honored both the classical traditions of her Amazon heritage and the modern sensibilities that had shaped her character development during the crisis period. The costume redesign that emerged from this collaboration maintained connection to her iconic appearance, while updating elements that reflected her evolved role and enhanced powers. The expanded pantheon of gods and mythological figures that became part of Diana's supporting cast following the crisis reflected both the cosmic scope of her mission and the recognition that her adventures required a framework capable of addressing threats that transcended the merely terrestrial. The involvement of deities from multiple pantheons in her ongoing story acknowledged the universal nature of the principles she championed, while also providing rich sources of conflict and alliance. The deepening of her relationships with other heroes during this period reflected both her own growth as a character and the evolution of the superhero community toward greater cooperation and mutual support in facing threats that exceeded the capabilities of individual champions. Her role as a founding member of the Reformed Justice League provided her with opportunities to serve as mentor and leader, while also learning from colleagues whose different backgrounds and approaches complemented her own skills and perspective. The philosophical themes that emerged from Diana's post-crisis adventures emphasized the importance of choice and personal responsibility in defining character and determining destiny, reflecting the lessons she had learned during her period of mortality about the sources of true strength and the nature of heroic achievement. The recognition that power without wisdom was dangerous, while wisdom without power was often ineffective, informed her approach to both individual conflicts and larger questions of justice and social change. The expansion of her mission to encompass not only the protection of innocent individuals, but the promotion of understanding and cooperation between different cultures and belief systems reflected her growing recognition that lasting peace required more than the defeat of obvious villains. Her work as an ambassador and cultural bridge builder demonstrated that superhuman abilities could be most effectively employed in service of goals that transcended immediate crisis management to address the root causes of conflict and suffering. The legacy of Diana's transformation during this pivotal period in her existence extended far beyond the personal growth and enhanced capabilities she had gained through her trials, establishing precedents and principles that would guide her heroic career for decades to come. The clay-born goddess who had learned to be human had become something unprecedented in the annals of heroic legend, a being who combined divine power with mortal wisdom in service of a mission that encompassed both worlds and all the conscious beings who struggled to find meaning and justice in an often chaotic and indifferent universe. The emergence of Diana as a cornerstone of the modern superhero community during the 1980s and 90s marked not merely her restoration to prominence following the cosmic upheavals that had redefined her origin, but her evolution into something unprecedented in the annals of heroic legend. A being who combined the wisdom of ages with the adaptability necessary to address challenges that transcended the traditional boundaries between personal conflict and universal crisis. The world that welcomed her return was itself transformed, shaped by technological marvels and social revolutions that had altered the very nature of human civilization while creating new forms of threat that required equally innovative responses. The reformation of the Justice League during this period reflected broader changes in the superhero community's understanding of its role and responsibilities, as the simple model of individual heroes responding to discrete criminal threats evolved into something more sophisticated and comprehensive. Diana's position as one of the founding members of this reconstituted organization placed her at the center of debates about accountability, methodology, and the proper relationship between enhanced individuals and the societies they served. Discussions that would define the parameters of heroic action for generations to come. The Trinity that emerged from the natural leadership dynamic between Diana, Superman, and Batman represented more than mere administrative convenience or tactical efficiency, becoming instead a symbolic representation of the different approaches that moral beings could take in their response to evil and suffering. Where Superman embodied the possibility of inspiring others through example and compassionate intervention, and Batman demonstrated the effectiveness of strategic thinking and technological innovation in service of justice, Diana represented the synthesis of these approaches through wisdom that had been tested in both mortal and divine realms. The philosophical debates that occurred during the League's planning sessions revealed fundamental differences in worldview and methodology that enriched the organization's decision-making processes, while also creating tensions that required constant navigation and compromise. Diana's perspective, informed by centuries of experience and her unique background as both Amazon warrior and diplomatic ambassador, often served as a bridge between the idealistic optimism that Superman brought to their work and the pragmatic cynicism that shaped Batman's approach to crime fighting. The headquarters that housed the League's operations during this era reflected the increased sophistication and global scope of their mission, featuring technology that rivaled or exceeded the most advanced systems available to any government or corporation, while also incorporating mystical elements and alien artifacts that acknowledged the supernatural dimensions of many threats they faced. Diana's contributions to the design and operation of these facilities drew upon both her Amazon heritage and her experience with advanced civilizations encountered during her cosmic adventures. The roster of heroes who joined the League during Diana's tenure as a founding member represented the increasing diversity of backgrounds and abilities that characterized the modern superhero community, including individuals whose powers derived from mutation, technology, magic, and alien heritage, rather than the classical divine blessings that had once seemed to dominate the ranks of Earth's champions. The integration of these different perspectives and capabilities required diplomatic skills that Diana was uniquely qualified to provide. The threats that challenged the League during this period reflected the escalating complexity and interconnectedness of dangers facing human civilization, as traditional categories of villain and crisis gave way to multidimensional conspiracies and cosmic conflicts that required coordinated responses from multiple heroes working in perfect synchronization. Diana's role in these battles often involved serving as the moral center that kept the team focused on their ultimate goals of protecting innocent life and preserving the principles of justice and freedom. The relationship between Diana and Cassandra Sandsmark, the young archaeology student who would eventually become the second Wonder Girl, represented a new dimension in Diana's heroic career as she accepted the responsibilities of mentorship and guidance that came with her status as one of the world's most experienced champions. The process of training and educating a successor forced Diana to articulate principles and techniques that had become instinctive through decades of practice, deepening her own understanding of what it meant to be a hero. The archaeological expedition that brought Cassie into Diana's orbit was investigating artifacts connected to ancient Amazon settlements that had been established far from Themyscira, remnants of an earlier age when her people had maintained outposts throughout the Mediterranean world before withdrawing to the complete isolation of Paradise Island. The discovery of these sites provided new insights into Amazon history while also revealing evidence of threats that had been contained but not eliminated by her ancestors' vigilance. The awakening of Cassie's latent abilities during a crisis at one of these archaeological sites demonstrated that the potential for heroism could manifest in unexpected individuals when circumstances demanded extraordinary responses to immediate dangers. The young woman's instinctive use of mystical artifacts to protect others revealed both her worthiness to inherit Amazon traditions and her need for proper training to channel her newfound abilities constructively rather than destructively. The training regimen that Diana developed for her protégé drew upon both the classical Amazon methods she had learned on Paradise Island and the hard-won insights she had gained during her years of depowerment, emphasizing the importance of moral development and intellectual growth alongside physical conditioning and combat skills. The recognition that true strength came from character rather than supernatural abilities informed every aspect of Cassie's education as a hero. The costume and equipment that were crafted for Wonder Girl honored the traditions of Amazon heroism, while also reflecting the unique personality and capabilities of their new wearer, creating visual continuity with the Wonder Woman legacy, while allowing for individual expression and adaptation. The lasso of lightning that became Cassie's signature weapon was forged using techniques that combined mystical craftsmanship with modern metallurgy, producing an artifact that was both functionally effective and symbolically meaningful. The adventures that Diana and Cassie shared during the young hero's training period provided opportunities for practical application of theoretical lessons, while also strengthening the bonds of trust and respect that were essential for effective mentorship relationships. The criminals and minor villains they encountered together were chosen specifically for their educational value, presenting challenges that required teamwork, strategic thinking, and moral judgment rather than simply overwhelming force. The expansion of Diana's activities to encompass global diplomatic initiatives reflected her growing recognition that the most significant threats to human welfare often originated from systemic problems rather than individual villains, requiring interventions that addressed root causes rather than merely responding to symptoms. Her work with the United Nations and other international organizations positioned her to influence policy decisions that affected millions of people, while also providing her with intelligence about emerging threats before they reached crisis levels. The cultural exchange programs that Diana established between Themyscira and various nations around the world served multiple purposes, sharing Amazon knowledge and techniques with societies that could benefit from their wisdom, while also ensuring that her people remained connected to the broader world rather than retreating into isolation. These initiatives required careful navigation of political sensitivities and cultural differences, skills that Diana had developed through decades of diplomatic experience. The emergence of new categories of supervillain during this period challenged established approaches to crime fighting and conflict resolution, as enemies empowered by corporate resources, government backing, or technological innovation proved resistant to traditional heroic interventions. Diana's encounters with these adversaries required her to develop new strategies that emphasized investigation, alliance building, and systematic dismantling of support networks, rather than direct confrontation with individual leaders. The Villainy Incorporated organization that became one of Diana's most persistent adversaries during this era represented the evolution of criminal enterprises from amateur operations led by obsessed individuals into sophisticated networks that combined multiple forms of expertise and resources in pursuit of complex goals. The interdisciplinary nature of these threats required equally comprehensive responses that drew upon the full range of Diana's abilities and connections. The psychological profiles that Diana developed of her recurring enemies during this period revealed patterns and motivations that transcended simple greed or power hunger, encompassing philosophical disagreements about the nature of progress, justice, and human potential that elevated their conflicts beyond mere law enforcement into debates about the future of civilization itself. The recognition that many villains were motivated by genuine beliefs rather than pure malice influenced her approach to rehabilitation and conflict resolution. The technological marvels that became available to both heroes and villains during this era of rapid innovation, created new possibilities for both protection and destruction that required constant adaptation and learning from all participants in the ongoing struggle between order and chaos. Diana's integration of advanced equipment into her traditional fighting style demonstrated that even classical approaches to heroism could benefit from selective modernization and enhancement. The mystical threats that continued to emerge from Diana's connection to ancient powers and forgotten civilizations required her to maintain expertise in supernatural matters, while also staying current with technological and scientific developments that might intersect with magical phenomena in unexpected ways. The balance between these different domains of knowledge reflected her unique position as a bridge between worlds and traditions. The romance that developed between Diana and Superman during certain periods of continuity represented more than mere personal attraction, embodying the possibility that beings of extraordinary power and responsibility might find in each other the understanding and companionship that their unique circumstances made difficult to achieve with purely mortal partners. The relationship challenged both heroes to examine their own assumptions about love, duty, and the compatibility of intimate personal connections with cosmic responsibilities. The philosophical discussions that characterized Diana's relationship with Superman explored questions about the nature of heroism and the proper use of power that went beyond romantic concerns to encompass fundamental issues of ethics and responsibility. Their different backgrounds and approaches to problem-solving created productive tensions that enriched both their individual development and their collaborative efforts to protect the innocent and preserve justice. The public reaction to the revelation of their relationship reflected broader social attitudes about celebrity, privacy, and the proper behavior of public figures, forcing both heroes to confront questions about the extent to which their personal choices were legitimately subject to public scrutiny and judgment. The media attention and fan response created additional pressures that complicated their already challenging lives as protectors of human civilization. The cosmic threats that tested the relationship between Diana and Superman demonstrated that even the strongest personal bonds could be strained by circumstances that forced individuals to choose between competing loyalties, obligations. The resolution of these conflicts required both heroes to develop deeper understanding of each other's values and priorities, while also maintaining their individual integrity and commitment to their respective missions. The eventual conclusion of their romantic relationship was handled with the maturity and mutual respect that characterized both individuals, acknowledging that love alone was insufficient to overcome fundamental differences in perspective and approach that made long-term partnership problematic, despite their genuine affection and admiration for each other. The friendship that emerged from their romantic connection proved more durable and ultimately more valuable than the passion that had initially brought them together. The expansion of Diana's supporting cast during this period reflected the increasing complexity of her mission and the recognition that even someone of her abilities required assistance and collaboration to address the full spectrum of challenges facing modern civilization. The network of allies, informants, and specialists that she cultivated provided her with resources and capabilities that complemented her own strengths, while also creating relationships that enriched her personal life. The integration of mythological figures and supernatural beings into Diana's regular adventures acknowledged the continuing influence of ancient powers in the modern world, while also exploring questions about the relevance of classical wisdom in addressing contemporary problems. The gods and spirits who occasionally served as allies or advisors brought perspectives that transcended human limitations, while also creating complications that required careful diplomatic handling. The evolution of Diana's civilian identity during this period reflected changes in both her own priorities and the society she served. as the traditional boundaries between secret identity and public persona became increasingly blurred by media attention and technological surveillance. The decision to maintain certain aspects of privacy while acknowledging her public role required constant balance between competing demands and expectations. The charitable organizations and social causes that Diana supported through both her Wonder Woman persona and her civilian identity demonstrated her commitment to addressing the root causes of social problems rather than merely responding to their criminal manifestations. The foundation work and advocacy that occupied much of her non-heroic time reflected her understanding that lasting change required sustained effort and institutional support rather than dramatic individual interventions. The artistic and cultural projects that Diana became involved with during this period served both educational and inspirational purposes, using her platform and resources to promote understanding of Amazon values and mythology, while also celebrating the achievements and potential of women throughout human history. The exhibitions, publications, and media productions that resulted from these efforts extended her influence beyond the realm of crime fighting into areas of cultural development and social consciousness. The scientific collaborations that Diana participated in during this era reflected her recognition that the boundaries between magic and technology were becoming increasingly irrelevant as human knowledge expanded to encompass phenomena that had once been considered purely supernatural. The research projects and experiments that benefited from her unique perspective and abilities contributed to advances in fields ranging from archaeology to physics. The international incidents that required Diana's intervention as both superhero and diplomatic representative tested her ability to navigate complex political situations while maintaining her commitment to justice and protection of Paida, innocent life. The resolution of these crises often required creative solutions that satisfied multiple competing interests while also establishing precedents for future cooperation between enhanced individuals and conventional authorities. The legacy that Diana established during this transformative period of her heroic career extended far beyond her individual achievements to encompass the precedents she set for future generations of heroes and the institutions she helped create to support and coordinate their efforts. The modern Amazon who had learned to balance divine heritage with mortal wisdom had become a template for heroism that transcended the limitations of both purely human and purely supernatural approaches to the eternal struggle between creation and destruction, order and chaos, justice and oppression. The dawn of the 21st century brought with it not merely the passage of chronological time, but a fundamental reshaping of reality itself that would test every assumption Diana had formed about the nature of existence, identity, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos that defined the heroic path. The cosmic forces that had once seemed stable and predictable were revealed to be far more mutable and interconnected than even the gods themselves had fully understood, creating circumstances that required unprecedented adaptations and responses from all beings who claimed to serve the cause of justice and truth. The reality-altering events that would come to be known as the New 52 represented more than mere editorial restructuring or cosmetic updates to familiar characters and storylines, instead constituting a genuine metaphysical transformation that rewrote the fundamental laws governing the DC multiverse, while preserving certain essential elements that were deemed too important to sacrifice on the altar of innovation and modernization. Diana found herself experiencing this transformation, not as an external observer, but as an active participant whose very essence was being reconstituted, according to principles that challenged everything she thought she knew about her own origins and destiny. The revelation that her clay-born creation had been merely one layer of a far more complex truth involving multiple pantheons and cosmic forces beyond the comprehension of even the Olympian gods forced Diana to reconsider every aspect of her identity and mission in ways that were both liberating and terrifying. The discovery that her divine heritage extended beyond the Greek pantheon to encompass relationships with primordial entities that predated conventional mythology opened new possibilities for understanding her role in the universal order, while also creating new responsibilities and vulnerabilities that she had never anticipated. Brian Azzarello's reinterpretation of Wonder Woman's mythology during this period emphasized the darker and more primal aspects of divine politics and supernatural conflict, revealing that the gods who had seemed benevolent protectors during Diana's earlier adventures were actually engaged in power struggles and personal vendettas that treated mortal concerns as trivial distractions from more important cosmic matters. The Pantheon Wars that erupted during this era forced Diana to choose sides in conflicts where traditional concepts of good and evil proved inadequate to the complexity of the issues at stake. The relationship between Diana and Superman that developed during this reimagined continuity reflected both the altered circumstances of their respective origins and the recognition that beings of their power and responsibility might naturally gravitate toward each other in ways that transcended mere romantic attraction or strategic alliance. The connection they shared was presented as something fundamental and inevitable, rooted in their shared status as the last survivors of advanced civilizations and their common commitment to protecting a world that would never fully understand or appreciate their sacrifices. The philosophical implications of their relationship extended beyond personal considerations to encompass questions about the nature of heroism and the proper use of power that resonated throughout their respective mythologies and supporting castes. The union of the Amazon princess and the Kryptonian survivor represented a synthesis of different heroic traditions and approaches to justice that created new possibilities for addressing threats that exceeded the capabilities of either individual acting alone. The cosmic scope of the challenges they faced together during this period required both heroes to transcend their individual limitations and develop new forms of cooperation and coordination that maximized their combined effectiveness, while preserving their distinct identities and approaches to problem solving. The battles against entities like Doomsday, Darkseid, and the Anti-Monitor demonstrated that even beings of godlike power required allies and support systems to survive encounters with forces that threatened the very fabric of reality itself. The emergence of the Firstborn as Diana's primary antagonist during this era represented a new category of threat that combined personal vendetta with cosmic significance, as her half-brother's claim to the throne of Olympus was backed by both legitimate grievance and overwhelming power that challenged her ability to protect both the mortal and divine realms from his destructive ambitions. The family dynamics that complicated their conflict added psychological dimensions that pure physical combat could not resolve. The revelation that Diana herself was destined to inherit the mantle of God of War following Ares' defeat created moral complexities that challenged her understanding of her own nature and mission in ways that forced her to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the compatibility of warfare and justice. The acceptance of this divine role required her to embrace aspects of her heritage that she had previously rejected or ignored, acknowledging that sometimes the preservation of peace required the skillful application of controlled violence. The philosophical transformation that accompanied Diana's assumption of her war god responsibilities reflected deeper changes in her understanding of the nature of conflict and the role that strategic thinking and tactical planning played in protecting innocent life from those who would exploit weakness and vulnerability for personal gain. The recognition that pacifism without the capability and willingness to defend it was ultimately self-defeating informed her approach to both individual battles and larger questions of international relations and cosmic politics. The expansion of her supporting cast to include mythological figures from multiple pantheons reflected the broadening scope of her mission and the recognition that the threats facing modern civilization required resources and perspectives that transcended any single cultural or religious tradition. The alliances she formed with gods and spirits from Egyptian, Norse, and other mythologies created opportunities for collaboration, while also generating conflicts and complications that tested her diplomatic skills. The evolution of her relationship with the Olympian pantheon during this period was marked by increasing tension and eventual open conflict, as Diana's commitment to protecting mortal interests came into direct opposition with the gods' tendency to treat human concerns as insignificant compared to their own power struggles and personal vendettas. The recognition that her divine relatives were not necessarily allies in her mission to promote justice and truth forced her to develop independence and self-reliance that transcended her original role as their chosen champion. The technological and mystical artifacts that Diana acquired or created during this era reflected both the expanded scope of her responsibilities and the need for tools that could function effectively in conflicts that spanned multiple dimensions and reality levels. The weapons and equipment that were forged for her use combined classical craftsmanship with innovative techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible through the intersection of magic and advanced science. The costume modifications that accompanied her transformation into the God of War maintained visual continuity with her iconic appearance, while incorporating elements that reflected her enhanced status and expanded capabilities. The armor and accessories that were added to her traditional outfit served both practical and symbolic purposes, providing protection against cosmic-level threats while also announcing her elevated position within the divine hierarchy. The battles that defined Diana's career during this period were notable for their scale and complexity, involving not merely individual villains or criminal organizations, but entire pantheons and cosmic forces whose conflicts affected the fundamental structure of reality itself. The strategies she developed for these encounters required her to think beyond conventional tactical considerations to encompass metaphysical and philosophical dimensions that transcended normal understanding of cause and effect. The Forever Evil event that tested the limits of Diana's capabilities and resolve demonstrated that even beings of godlike power could be overwhelmed by circumstances that combined multiple threats and challenges into scenarios that exceeded any individual's capacity to address through direct action alone. The necessity of working within temporary alliances that included former enemies and morally questionable allies forced her to compromise certain principles while maintaining others, creating complex ethical dilemmas that had no perfect solutions. The dark side war that followed represented the culmination of long-standing conflicts between cosmic forces that had been building toward inevitable confrontation across multiple storylines and character arcs. Diana's role in these events required her to balance her responsibilities as protector of Earth with her obligations as a member of the divine community, navigating political complexities that would have challenged even the most experienced diplomatic professionals. The transformation that Diana underwent when she briefly wielded the power of the God of Knowledge during the Dark Side War provided her with unprecedented understanding of the interconnected nature of reality and the complex relationships between seemingly separate events and individuals across space and time. The insights she gained during this period of enhanced awareness influenced her approach to problem solving and conflict resolution long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. The psychological impact of experiencing omniscience, even temporarily, forced Diana to confront questions about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom that challenged her previous assumptions about the value of information and understanding. The recognition that knowing everything did not automatically provide the moral clarity necessary to make correct decisions added new dimensions to her ongoing development as both hero and leader. The responsibility of serving as leader of the Justice League during various crises throughout this period tested Diana's ability to coordinate the efforts of individuals whose personalities, methods, and priorities often conflicted with each other in ways that threatened the effectiveness of their collaborative efforts. The diplomatic and managerial skills she developed through these experiences proved as valuable as her combat abilities in addressing threats that required unified responses from multiple heroes. The mentorship relationships that Diana established with younger heroes during this era reflected her growing recognition that the preservation of heroic ideals and traditions required active cultivation of the next generation rather than simply hoping that suitable individuals would emerge. Naturally, when circumstances demanded their services, the training and guidance she provided to characters like Cassie Sandsmark and other aspiring champions ensured continuity of values and approaches that transcended any individual's career or lifespan. The exploration of Diana's romantic relationships during this period acknowledged the complexity of maintaining intimate personal connections while fulfilling responsibilities that often required sacrifice of individual desires and preferences in service of larger causes and greater goods. The challenges she faced in balancing personal happiness with heroic duty reflected universal themes that resonated with readers, regardless of their own superhuman status or cosmic responsibilities. The cultural and social commentary that was woven throughout Diana's adventures during this transformative period addressed contemporary issues and concerns through the lens of mythological and superheroic metaphor, creating stories that were simultaneously fantastical entertainment and serious examination of real-world problems and potential solutions. The relevance of ancient wisdom to modern challenges was demonstrated through scenarios that honored both tradition and innovation. The artistic evolution that characterized Wonder Woman comics during this era reflected changing sensibilities and techniques in the medium itself, as creators experimented with new approaches to visual storytelling and narrative structure that pushed the boundaries of what sequential art could accomplish in terms of emotional impact and intellectual engagement. The collaboration between writers and artists created unified visions that served both aesthetic and thematic purposes. The critical reception of these reimagined Wonder Woman stories demonstrated the continuing relevance and appeal of the character, while also revealing the challenges inherent in updating classic mythologies for contemporary audiences, without losing the essential elements that made them timeless and universally meaningful. The balance between innovation and tradition required careful navigation of competing demands and expectations from different segments of the readership. The influence of these stories on subsequent interpretations and adaptations of Wonder Woman in other media reflected their success in establishing new canonical elements and character developments that enriched rather than replaced previous versions of her mythology. The expansion of her backstory and supporting cast provided material for future creators, while maintaining continuity with established traditions and fan expectations. The philosophical themes that emerged from Diana's adventures during this period emphasized the importance of choice and personal responsibility in defining character and determining destiny, while also acknowledging the influence of external forces and inherited characteristics that shaped but did not determine individual behavior and moral development. The interplay between fate and free will was explored through scenarios that tested both concepts against practical reality. The cosmic implications of Diana's evolving role within the DC universe reflected the recognition that local and planetary concerns were inextricably connected to larger patterns and forces that operated on scales that transcended normal human comprehension, requiring heroes to develop perspectives and capabilities that matched the scope of the responsibilities they had accepted. The clay-born goddess, who had once focused primarily on individual acts of heroism, had become a cosmic champion whose influence extended throughout multiple dimensions of existence. The legacy of this transformative period in Diana's existence established precedents and principles that would continue to influence her character development and story potential for generations of creators and readers, demonstrating that even the most established and iconic characters could be reimagined and revitalized without losing their essential appeal and meaning. The Amazon princess, who had learned to embrace her role as god of war while maintaining her commitment to peace and justice, had become a more complex and compelling figure whose adventures could address the full spectrum of human experience and cosmic possibility. The cosmic upheavals that had reshaped reality itself during the previous era of Diana's existence gave way to a period of careful reconstruction and thoughtful re-examination that would come to be known as rebirth, a time when the fundamental truths that had been obscured by years of confusion and contradiction were allowed to reassert themselves, while incorporating the wisdom and experience that had been gained through suffering and transformation. The universe that emerged from this process of renewal was neither the pristine original that had existed before the great changes, nor the chaotic amalgamation that had temporarily replaced it, but rather a synthesis that honored both tradition and innovation, while creating space for growth and development that had previously seemed impossible. Greg Rucka's return to Wonder Woman during this pivotal period brought with it a clarity of vision and depth of understanding that had been honed through years of contemplating the essential nature of heroism and the specific challenges faced by characters who embodied principles that transcended simple entertainment or escapist fantasy. His approach to Diana's mythology emphasized the timeless aspects of her story, while also acknowledging the ways in which even eternal truths must find new forms of expression to remain relevant and meaningful in changing times and circumstances. The Year One storyline that Rucka crafted served not merely as another retelling of familiar origin material, but as a definitive statement about the core elements that made Diana's journey from clay-born princess to champion of justice both unique and universal in its appeal and significance. The careful attention to detail and psychological authenticity that characterized this narrative established new standards for how classic superhero origins could be revisited and revitalized without losing their essential power and meaning. The emphasis on Diana's relationships with other women throughout her life provided a corrective to previous interpretations that had sometimes marginalized the importance of female friendship and mentorship in favor of romantic entanglements that, while certainly significant, were not the sole or even primary source of meaning and growth in her existence. The bonds she formed with her Amazon sisters, with mortal women who became allies and confidantes, and with younger heroes who looked to her for guidance, were revealed to be just as crucial to her development as any connection she might form with male companions. The political and social dimensions of Diana's mission were explored with new sophistication and nuance during this period, acknowledging that the fight for justice necessarily involved engagement with systems and structures that perpetuated inequality and oppression, rather than simply responding to the individual manifestations of evil that attracted media, attention, and public awareness. The recognition that lasting change required sustained effort and institutional transformation informed her approach to both immediate crises and long-term strategic planning. The refinement of Diana's origin story during the Rebirth era clarified certain confusing elements that had accumulated during previous reinterpretations while preserving the mythological richness and divine significance that made her unique among superheroes. The revelation that she was indeed formed from clay by her mother's loving hands and given life by the gods' blessing restored the miraculous nature of her creation, while also incorporating insights about the nature of divine intervention and mortal agency that had emerged from recent adventures. The expansion of Themyscira's role in contemporary global affairs reflected Diana's growing understanding that her homeland's isolation, while understandable given historical circumstances, was no longer sustainable or beneficial in a world where interconnectedness and cooperation were essential for addressing challenges that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. The gradual opening of Paradise Island to carefully selected visitors and cultural exchanges created opportunities for mutual learning and understanding while maintaining the security and privacy that the Amazons required. The relationship between Diana and Barbara Ann Minerva that was developed during this period added layers of complexity and tragedy to the cheetah persona, revealing the brilliant archaeologist's transformation into a predatory monster as the result of choices made under extreme circumstances rather than simple malice or greed. The friendship that had once existed between them added emotional weight to their confrontations, while also suggesting possibilities for redemption and healing that transcended the immediate necessity of stopping Cheetah's criminal activities. The psychological exploration of Minerva's condition and the supernatural forces that had corrupted her provided insights into the nature of possession and transformation that applied to other cases where good people had been twisted into enemies through external influences beyond their control. The research that Diana conducted into possible cures and treatments for such conditions reflected her commitment to redemption and healing rather than simply punishment and containment for those who had lost their way. The evolution of Diana's supporting cast during the Rebirth era brought together elements from different periods of her publication history, while adding new characters whose presence enriched her world and provided fresh opportunities for storytelling and character development. The careful balance between honoring established relationships and creating space for innovation demonstrated the value of continuity when it was employed thoughtfully rather than rigidly. The lasso of truth that became the focus of renewed attention and exploration during this period was revealed to possess depths and complexities that went far beyond its basic function of compelling honesty from those bound by its golden coils. The artifact's connection to divine truth and its ability to reveal not only factual accuracy, but deeper spiritual and emotional realities, made it a tool for healing and understanding, rather than simply interrogation and punishment. The philosophical implications of wielding such a weapon raised questions about the nature of truth itself and the responsibilities that came with the power to compel others to confront realities they might prefer to avoid or deny. Diana's careful and thoughtful use of the lasso demonstrated wisdom that had been earned through years of experience with the complex relationship between truth and justice, knowledge and compassion. The costume refinements that were implemented during this period maintained visual continuity with Diana's iconic appearance, while making subtle adjustments that reflected both artistic evolution and practical considerations about functionality and symbolic meaning. The modifications honored the classical elements that had made her instantly recognizable, while updating aspects that had become dated or problematic in light of changing social attitudes and expectations. The exploration of Diana's relationships with the gods during the Rebirth era acknowledged both the benefits and the complications that arose from her divine heritage, presenting the Olympian pantheon as complex beings with their own agendas and limitations, rather than simply benevolent benefactors who could be relied upon for consistent support and guidance. The tensions that developed between her commitment to protecting mortals and the gods' tendency to prioritize their own concerns created ongoing sources of conflict and character development. The recurring theme of choice and its consequences that ran through Diana's adventures during this period emphasized the importance of moral agency and personal responsibility in defining character and determining destiny. The recognition that even beings with divine heritage and supernatural abilities were bound by the same ethical principles that governed all conscious beings provided a foundation for stories that combined spectacular action with meaningful philosophical content. The introduction of new villains and the reinterpretation of classic enemies during the Rebirth era created a rogues gallery that reflected both the timeless nature of evil and its ability to adapt and evolve in response to changing circumstances and opportunities. The psychological complexity and realistic motivations that characterized these antagonists made them more than simple obstacles to be overcome, transforming them into genuine challenges that tested Diana's intellect and moral reasoning, as well as her physical capabilities. The relationship between Diana and Steve Trevor that was re-established during this period honored their historical connection, while acknowledging the ways in which both characters had grown and changed during their years apart. The mature love that developed between them was based on mutual respect and shared values rather than simple attraction, creating a foundation for partnership that could withstand the pressures and challenges of their respective careers. The integration of Diana's heroic activities with her civilian identity became more seamless during this era, as the artificial separation between Wonder Woman and Diana Prince gave way to a more authentic presentation of a complete individual who embodied heroic principles in all aspects of her existence rather than compartmentalizing different aspects of her personality and purpose. The global scope of Diana's mission expanded during the Rebirth period to encompass challenges that required international cooperation and cross-cultural understanding, reflecting the recognition that justice and truth were universal values that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. The diplomatic skills that she had developed through decades of experience proved as valuable as her combat abilities in addressing conflicts that could not be resolved through force alone. The mentorship relationships that Diana established with younger heroes during this time reflected her growing awareness that the preservation and transmission of heroic values required active cultivation and careful guidance rather than simply hoping that suitable individuals would emerge. Naturally, when circumstances demanded their services, the training and support she provided to the next generation ensured continuity of principles and approaches that transcended any individual's career or lifespan. The exploration of Diana's immortality and its implications for her relationships and psychological development added depth to her character that acknowledged the unique challenges faced by beings who must watch mortal friends age and die while remaining essentially unchanged themselves. The wisdom that came from such extended experience was balanced by the emotional costs of outliving those she cared about and the difficulty of forming deep connections with beings whose lifespans were so brief compared to her own. The scientific and technological elements that were incorporated into Diana's adventures during this period demonstrated that magic and science were not incompatible opposites, but rather different approaches to understanding and manipulating the same underlying reality. The collaboration between Amazon mysticism and modern research created possibilities for innovation and discovery that neither tradition could achieve independently. The social justice themes that permeated Diana's stories during the Rebirth era addressed contemporary issues and concerns, while maintaining the mythological framework that made her adventures timeless rather than merely topical. The balance between relevance and universality ensured that the stories could speak to current readers, while also possessing lasting value that would endure beyond immediate circumstances. The artistic collaboration between writers and artists during this period produced visual narratives that combined spectacular action sequences with intimate character moments, creating a reading experience that satisfied both the desire for excitement and the need for emotional and intellectual engagement. The integration of text and imagery achieved new levels of sophistication that elevated sequential art as a medium for serious storytelling. The critical and commercial success of Diana's adventures during the Rebirth era demonstrated the continued relevance and appeal of her character, while also proving that classic superheroes could be updated and revitalized without sacrificing the essential elements that had made them enduring icons. The balance between innovation and tradition provided a model for how other established characters and concepts could be approached with respect for their history and potential for their future. The influence of these stories on other media adaptations and interpretations of Wonder Woman reflected their success in establishing new canonical elements and character developments that enriched rather than replaced previous versions of her mythology. The expansion of her narrative possibilities provided material for future creators while maintaining continuity with established traditions and reader expectations. The philosophical and spiritual themes that emerged from Diana's Rebirth-era adventures emphasized the interconnectedness of all conscious beings and the responsibility that came with power and privilege to serve causes greater than oneself. The recognition that heroism was not merely about individual achievement but about contributing to the collective well-being of all life provided a framework for understanding both personal fulfillment and social responsibility. The legacy of the Rebirth period in Diana's existence established foundations for future development, while also serving as a culmination of themes and character growth that had been building across decades of publication. The clay-born goddess, who had learned to navigate the complexities of modern existence while maintaining her commitment to ancient values, had become a fully realized character whose adventures could address the full spectrum of human masis, experience, and cosmic possibility. The resolution of long-standing plot threads and character arcs during this era provided closure for some storylines while opening new possibilities for exploration and development. The careful balance between concluding established narratives and creating space for future growth demonstrated the value of thoughtful continuity planning and character development that served both immediate storytelling needs and long-term creative potential. The international recognition that Diana received during this period reflected not only her individual achievements, but also the broader acceptance of superheroic intervention in global affairs and the recognition that some problems required solutions that transcended conventional political and military approaches. The trust that world leaders placed in her judgment and capabilities represented a new level of integration between the superhero community and traditional institutions of authority and governance. The personal growth that Diana experienced during the Rebirth era encompassed emotional, intellectual, and spiritual dimensions that made her a more complete and compelling character whose struggles and triumphs resonated with readers regardless of their own supernatural abilities or cosmic responsibilities. The humanity that she had learned to embrace during her period of depowerment continued to inform her approach to heroism, even after her full powers and divine status had been restored. The transcendence of Diana's story beyond the boundaries of sequential art and comic book publishing into the broader realms of global culture and collective consciousness represents perhaps the most remarkable achievement in the comic book annals of fictional character development, a transformation that elevated a creation born from wartime necessity and mythological inspiration into something approaching genuine cultural deity whose influence extends far beyond the entertainment industry that gave her birth. The journey from four-color pages to worldwide recognition encompasses not merely adaptation and interpretation, but genuine metamorphosis, as the clay-born Amazon princess evolved into a symbol whose meaning and significance continue to expand with each new generation of admirers and interpreters. The television series that brought Wonder Woman into American living rooms during the 1970s marked the beginning of her transformation from comic book character into cultural phenomenon, though the medium's limitations and the era's social constraints prevented the full realization of her potential as a vehicle for exploring complex themes about power, responsibility, and the nature of heroism in modern society. Linda Carter's portrayal established visual and performance standards that would influence all subsequent interpretations, while also demonstrating that audiences were ready to embrace a female superhero whose strength and independence challenged traditional gender roles and expectations. The iconic costume that Carter wore in her television appearances became instantly recognizable throughout the world, transcending its origins as practical television production design to become a symbol of female empowerment that was adopted by countless individuals who saw in Wonder Woman's image a reflection of their own aspirations for strength, confidence, and the courage to challenge injustice wherever they encountered it. The red, gold, and blue ensemble that had been designed for fictional adventures became real-world uniform for protesters, activists, and anyone who needed inspiration to stand up for principles they held sacred. The impact of Carter's performance extended beyond entertainment value to encompass genuine social influence, as young women and girls who watched her adventures on screen found in Wonder Woman a role model who demonstrated that femininity and strength were not incompatible opposites, but rather complementary aspects of complete human development. The character's combination of physical prowess and emotional intelligence, combat skills and diplomatic wisdom provided a template for female heroism that had been largely absent from popular culture prior to her emergence. The animated adaptations that followed the television series revealed new possibilities for exploring Wonder Woman's mythology without the budgetary constraints and special effects limitations that had restricted live-action productions, allowing creators to fully realize the cosmic scope and mythological richness that defined her comic book adventures. The voice actors who brought Diana to life in animated form contributed their own interpretations and nuances while building upon the foundation that Carter had established. The Super Friends cartoon series that introduced Wonder Woman to Saturday morning television audiences represented a significant democratization of her character, making her accessible to children who might never encounter comic books, while also establishing her as a core member of the Justice League in the minds of viewers who would carry that association throughout their lives. The simplified storytelling and moral clarity of these animated adventures distilled her character to its essential elements, while maintaining the inspirational power that made her appealing to audiences of all ages. The evolution of animation, technology, and storytelling sophistication that characterized later cartoon adaptations allowed for more complex and nuanced presentations of Diana's character and mythology, incorporating elements from different comic book eras, while creating new interpretations that honored her history, while also updating her for contemporary audiences. The artistic freedom that animation provided enabled creators to fully realize the visual spectacle and mythological grandeur that defined her most memorable comic book adventures. The voice acting performances that brought Diana to life across multiple animated series demonstrated the character's versatility and the different aspects of her personality that could be emphasized depending upon the needs of specific stories and target audiences. The range of interpretations, from maternal and nurturing to fierce and uncompromising, revealed the depth and complexity that made her appealing to creators and audiences alike. The DC animated universe that flourished during the 1990s and early 2000s provided Wonder Woman with her most sophisticated and fully realized adaptation outside of comic books, presenting her as a complex character whose divine heritage and warrior training were balanced by genuine compassion and diplomatic wisdom that made her an effective mediator and leader within the Justice League. The relationships and character development that occurred across multiple series and films created a coherent vision of Diana that honored her comic book origins while also establishing new canonical elements. The Justice League animated series that featured Wonder Woman as a core member of the team demonstrated her effectiveness as both solo hero and team player, showcasing combat skills and strategic thinking that made her invaluable in battles against cosmic threats, while also highlighting her role as moral center and voice of reason during internal conflicts and ethical debates. The dynamic between her warrior training and her commitment to peaceful resolution of conflicts created dramatic tension that drove many memorable episodes. The romantic relationships and personal connections that were explored in animated form added dimensions to Diana's character that had sometimes been underdeveloped in comic book stories, revealing vulnerabilities and desires that made her more relatable, without diminishing her status as an inspirational figure. The balance between her divine nature and human emotions provided rich material for character-driven storytelling that complemented the action-adventure elements. The film adaptations that eventually brought Wonder Woman to the big screen faced the challenge of introducing her to audiences who might have limited familiarity with comic book mythology, while also satisfying longtime fans who had specific expectations about her character and capabilities. The production difficulties and false starts that preceded her successful cinematic debut reflected the industry's uncertainty about the commercial viability of female-led superhero films and the technical challenges of translating her powers and mythology to live action. Gal Gadot's casting as Wonder Woman represented a breakthrough moment that validated the character's global appeal, while also introducing new elements and interpretations that enriched her mythology without contradicting established canonical elements. The physical presence and performance style that Gadot brought to the role established new standards for how strength and femininity could be combined in ways that were both authentic and inspirational. The World War I setting of her first solo film provided opportunities to explore themes about warfare, sacrifice, and the nature of evil that resonated with contemporary audiences, while also honoring the character's historical origins during World War II. The decision to relocate her first major adventure to an earlier conflict allowed for exploration of moral complexity and the fog of war without the clear-cut good versus evil dynamics that had characterized her original comic book stories. The box office success and critical acclaim that greeted Wonder Woman's solo film debut validated decades of fan advocacy, while also proving that audiences were hungry for superhero stories that emphasized hope and inspiration rather than cynicism and destruction. The financial performance demonstrated that female-led action films could achieve the same commercial success as their male-dominated counterparts when given proper support and promotion. The cultural impact of the film extended far beyond entertainment industry considerations to encompass genuine social influence, as the movie became a rallying point for discussions about gender representation, female empowerment, and the importance of positive role models in popular culture. The enthusiastic response from audiences who had been underserved by previous superhero adaptations demonstrated the hunger for characters and stories that reflected their own experiences and aspirations. The sequel films that followed faced the challenge of building upon the success of the first movie, while also exploring new aspects of Diana's character and expanding her mythology in ways that would sustain audience interest across multiple installments. The different time periods and settings that were chosen for these subsequent adventures allowed for exploration of how her character and values translated to different historical contexts and social circumstances. The video game appearances that brought Wonder Woman into interactive entertainment media provided players with opportunities to experience her powers and abilities firsthand, while also learning about her mythology and supporting cast through gameplay and narrative elements. The different game genres and platforms that featured her character demonstrated her versatility and appeal across multiple demographics and interest groups. The fighting games that included Wonder Woman as a playable character allowed players to experience her combat skills and special abilities in competitive contexts, while also showcasing her interactions with other famous characters from DC, comics, and beyond. The movesets and fighting styles that were developed for these games drew upon her comic book abilities, while also incorporating new elements designed specifically for gameplay purposes. The action-adventure games that cast players as Wonder Woman provided more comprehensive experiences that combined combat with exploration, puzzle solving, and story progression elements that allowed for deeper engagement with her character and world. The level design and mission structure of these games drew upon her comic book adventures, while also creating new scenarios and challenges designed specifically for interactive media. The mobile games and casual gaming experiences that featured Wonder Woman expanded her reach to audiences who might not traditionally engage with comic books or console games, demonstrating her appeal across different technological platforms and user demographics. The simplified gameplay and accessibility features of these applications made her character available to players regardless of their gaming experience or technical expertise. The merchandise and licensing opportunities that emerged from Wonder Woman's multimedia success created economic ecosystems that extended her cultural influence, while also providing revenue streams that supported continued development of new content and adaptations across different media platforms. The range of products and collectibles that bore her image demonstrated the breadth of her appeal and the diversity of ways that fans chose to express their appreciation for her character. The fashion and costume elements inspired by Wonder Woman's iconic appearance influenced clothing design and personal style choices that extended far beyond cosplay and convention attendance to encompass everyday fashion decisions by individuals who wanted to incorporate elements of her strength and confidence into their own personal presentation. The empowerment that people felt when wearing Wonder Woman-inspired clothing demonstrated the psychological impact of her visual design. The educational and academic attention that Wonder Woman received as a subject of scholarly analysis and cultural criticism validated her significance as more than mere entertainment, establishing her as a legitimate topic for serious discussion about mythology, feminism, popular culture, and the role of fictional characters in shaping social attitudes and values. The dissertations, articles, and books that examined different aspects of her character and cultural impact demonstrated her relevance beyond the comic book industry. The feminist scholarship that emerged around Wonder Woman's character explored both her progressive elements and her limitations as a representation of female empowerment, acknowledging that her creation by male writers and artists in a male-dominated industry had influenced her development in ways that sometimes conflicted with contemporary understanding of gender equality and women's liberation. The critical analysis that examined her strengths and weaknesses as a feminist icon provided valuable insights into the complex relationship between popular culture and social progress. The international adaptations and interpretations of Wonder Woman that emerged from different cultural contexts revealed both the universal appeal of her core concepts and the ways in which local values and traditions could influence how her character was understood and presented to different audiences. The variations in emphasis and interpretation that characterized these international versions demonstrated her flexibility as a character, while also highlighting the cultural specificity of certain aspects of her mythology. The cosplay community that emerged around Wonder Woman's character created new forms of fan engagement and creative expression that blurred the boundaries between consumption and production, spectatorship and participation, allowing individuals to embody her character while also contributing their own interpretations and innovations to her ongoing cultural presence. The skill and creativity that cosplayers brought to recreating and reimagining her costume and accessories demonstrated the inspirational power of her visual design. The convention appearances and fan events that featured Wonder Woman-related content provided opportunities for community building and shared celebration that strengthened the bonds between fans, while also introducing new audiences to her character and mythology. The panels, discussions, and presentations that explored different aspects of her stories and cultural significance created educational opportunities that complemented the entertainment value. The charity work and social activism that invoked Wonder Woman's name and image as symbols of justice and empowerment demonstrated the real-world applications of her inspirational message and the ways in which fictional characters could motivate genuine efforts to create positive change in society. The fundraising campaigns and awareness efforts that used her image showed how popular culture could be harnessed for beneficial purposes. The political and social movements that adopted Wonder Woman as a symbol or mascot reflected both the power of her image to inspire action and the complex relationship between popular culture and political activism in contemporary society. The appropriation of her character for various causes demonstrated her cultural significance, while also raising questions about the ownership and control of fictional symbols in public discourse. The museum exhibitions and cultural institutions that featured Wonder Woman-related artifacts and displays validated her significance as a cultural phenomenon worthy of preservation and scholarly attention, establishing her as a legitimate subject for historical and artistic analysis that transcended her origins as commercial entertainment. The curatorial decisions and interpretive materials that accompanied these exhibitions reflected different approaches to understanding her cultural impact. The literary analysis and critical interpretation that examined Wonder Woman's stories and character development provided frameworks for understanding her significance within the broader context of American mythology and popular culture, revealing connections and influences that extended far beyond the comic book industry to encompass literature, psychology, anthropology, and religious studies. The scholarly attention that her character received validated her importance as a cultural artifact. The influence that Wonder Woman exerted on subsequent creators and characters demonstrated her lasting impact on the development of popular culture and the expansion of possibilities for female representation in entertainment media. As writers and artists who had been inspired by her example created new characters and stories that built upon the foundation she had established, while also pushing boundaries in new directions. The legacy that Diana established through her transcendence of medium boundaries and cultural contexts created a template for how fictional characters could achieve genuine cultural significance and lasting influence that extended far beyond their original commercial purposes, demonstrating that the boundary between entertainment and inspiration was more permeable than many critics and scholars had previously acknowledged. The clay-born Amazon, who had begun as wartime propaganda, had become something approaching genuine mythology, a story and symbol that would continue to inspire and challenge audiences for generations to come, proving that the most enduring characters were those who embodied universal truths about courage, compassion, and the eternal struggle to create justice in an imperfect world. And so we reach the end of our journey through the chronicles of Diana of Themyscira, though her story continues to unfold across infinite possibilities and endless tomorrows. From clay shaped by divine hands to icons shaped by human hopes, she stands as eternal proof that truth and love can triumph over deception and hatred. In her battles against gods and monsters, tyrants and madmen, she has shown that true strength comes not from the power to destroy, but from the wisdom to protect and the courage to stand for justice, even when standing alone. The golden lasso that compels truth, the silver bracelets that deflect harm, the tiara that cuts through lies. These are but symbols of the deeper truths she represents. That compassion is not weakness, but the greatest strength. That justice without mercy becomes mere vengeance, and that love is the force that binds all things together in harmony, rather than allowing them to fall into chaos. Rest now, champion of dreams, knowing that somewhere among the stars, the amazing Amazon continues her eternal watch, protecting not just our world, but all worlds where truth and justice shine like beacons in the darkness, forever and always.